Hey everybody, it's Scott with Astonishing Legends. I am so thrilled to be here. We had a few technical issues, so we didn't start exactly on time, but we got it as close as we could. And I wanted to welcome everybody to our first live stream with our special guest, Micah Hanks. Next person I'm going to bring up here real quick will be our good friend and co-host, Forrest Burgess, who everybody knows. Forrest, please say hello to everyone.
Hello, everyone, and I'm looking into the camera as I do it for the first time.
Yeah. So it's good to have you here, Forrest. And then, of course, we have our friend, Mr. Micah Hanks, coming up here. Micah, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for volunteering to be a part of this technical mishap.
Well, it's a learning experience for everybody, but always glad to be here with you guys. In fact, when I heard that you guys we're going to be talking about Sasquatch tonight, I butted in and said, look, you got to let me come on with you. So these guys were kind enough to be accommodating, and here we are.
Well,
you're the only reason we're talking about Sasquatch. Yeah. It's because of you.
It's the other way around, but we're so glad to have you. It's such an honor to have you back on the show. And when we talked about, I guess you've been doing some really amazing research lately that predates when a lot of people who look at Sasquatch think that all of this Bigfoot stuff started, and a lot of them seem to trace it back to the Ray Wallace hoax that we talked about in the Patterson-Gimlin film, and you can refresh our listeners' memories on that for folks that didn't bother to listen to that giant multi-part lifelong series that we did. But it turns out that you've managed to uncover some things that might indicate that, and I love the way that you've looked at this, because it's the same way that we look at things, where you're checking how a story is changing direction. And sometimes it's as simple as a nomenclature being different, or a culture referring to something differently. And for whatever reason, in modern times, that whole timeline of knowledge is severed, right?
Yeah, certainly. First and foremost, I have to give you guys kudos. The way that you two do your research, and the way that you go deep, and the way that you understand personalities and historical events, and cultural aspects of, the investigation. Really, there are very few people who do it like you guys do and who go as deep as you do. And I'm not the only person who thinks so and appreciates that. I brought to your attention recently John Kirk, a fantastic researcher, who has referenced you guys when he's gone on other podcasts talking about Sasquatch and saying these guys just go deeper than anybody. And I have to agree. And I think it's really important, because we're to a point with this subject where a few of the things that I've kind of noticed, and I'm sure that we're going to get a little into, what's the rationale for the discussion of this and the study of it? How do we separate the hoaxes from, what may be true? A lot of people just, kind of accept as a foregone conclusion, this was all a hoax. It started in 1958. There's nothing before that. Well, I would argue differently. And again, this is really something I've begun to notice. If we're going to establish proper research methodologies, there are some fantastic, what I would term avocational researchers, people who may not be trained biologists or zoologists or anthropologists, but people who are learning proper scientific methods, how to apply the scientific method in the field, how to apply forensics, how to apply a variety of different resources while in the field, in the investigation, here and now today, in parts of North America, toward the furtherance of trying to establish that there's a zoological reality to Sasquatch. The approach that I take, although I love getting out in the forest and stomping around, in the mountains, I live here in Appalachia. It's one of my favorite things to do. But as far as my research with this, my main focus has been really trying to establish the historical evidence in support of it. And one reason that I want to do that is because, again, this, like you said, Scott, it comes back to the idea that, well, Bigfoot started as a hoax. Two things I've noticed. Countless articles I've read online try to establish this subject by saying, despite its origins as a hoax in California in 1958, believers won't be dissuaded. Believers are convinced that there's a creature actually out there. They won't hear anything about the hoax. So one thing that really over the last few years that has become apparent to me is that, well, okay, a lot of people really don't think this goes any further back than the 1950s, and they think it's absurd for people to suppose that there's an actual biological reality to Sasquatch, given that they accept, first and foremost, that it all started in the 1950s. But then we look at the skeptics who have looked a little deeper, and some of them even argue, well, look, the problem with Sasquatch is that there's no evidence in the historical record. And if we're talking about a biological specimen, it would have to have been something that was recognized throughout history, since Sasquatch and other purported, and again, the term I think that is really favored by most researchers these days, especially Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum of Idaho State University, Relict, hominoid, for there to be evidence of them to exist today, the skeptics rightly contend they should be evident throughout history. And since we don't have that, they couldn't exist. Well,
Right.
So it got me thinking, well, can we go further back? Can we find evidence of possible relict hominoid observations going back throughout time? I would contend, yes, you can, and I hope to present some of my findings for you guys tonight.
Oh, I love this. I honestly, I can't wait to. And I was looking at some of the stuff you shared with us. You've already done some really amazing shows on this with your multiple podcasts. You're very prolific. It is, and we'll talk about that when we get to the end tonight. I want you to plug all the stuff you're working on. But it's like your approach to this, I think, is really fascinating, and I like the idea of looking past the origins of this. So so where do you want to start? Are you going to start with where the skeptics usually leave off? Is that the the top of the discussion?
I'll just add here before we start is that, one, it's a terrific opportunity to have you on here because you're one of the few sources that we've heard talk about this that we know that we could invite on for a chat. But nobody else really seems to be delving into the proto-history, the pre-European history, and I do see a lot of what I would consider a bit of ethno-arrogance, I guess, or just Western central focus that is more of European study and not taking into consideration the native legends and lore, which of course I know it's hard to do from a scientific point, but we have that record as well, and we're not using some of that. So so thank you for coming on and explaining to a lot of us, ourselves even, about that history, because we're seeing this also with the UFO history, and that people are saying, well, that really is just a 70s phenomenon. And then we've just heard that the Lou Elizondo and the Pentagon know that the Tic Tac phenomenon, maybe that craft specifically, has been going on for at least 70 years. It's not, none of this is anything new.
Yeah, in fact, I actually have personally, just a brief anecdote on the UFO topic you bring up there, with all the interest in that. I've found reports of what are described, objects that are described in terms of being very similar, I guess, to what we would call the Tic Tac today. Yeah. They go all the way back to the late 1940s. Really, of course, the UFO phenomena, as it begins in modern terms, really starts in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold. Right. I spent about as much time looking into the proto-history of UFOs as I have the proto-history of Sasquatch. And I like that terminology, by the way, Forrest. I think that's a great way to phrase what we're discussing. So just to briefly state, as Lou Elizondo has recently discussed, and I've talked with him a little about this off the microphone, I think that indeed, you find a certain consistency, certain patterns in terms of the descriptions of some of these objects going all the way back to at least right after the beginning of the modern UFO era. For people to look at the so-called Tic Tac, in reference to the 2004 Nimitz incident and say, oh, this is some kind of a new experimental technology, perhaps that's true, but there are certainly UFO accounts going back decades prior to that seem to describe the same thing. But now, as far as the proto-history of the idea of Sasquatch, a few researchers have actually looked at this, at least going back before 1958, but there are some I think it would be safe to call it cognitive dissonance that erupts from time to time, because as a result of the fact that Bigfoot begins in 1958, there are some researchers that appear to try and make distinctions, and they go through some rather interesting mental gymnastics in order to do so, but they seem to try and separate Sasquatch from Bigfoot and say that these are entirely separate cultural concepts. And then if we go even further back, what accounts are known to exist, well, these are just, hearsay, myths, rumors, legend. What I hope to try and do tonight is, first of all, go way back. In fact, go back into the BC era, and we're going to bring it all the way up through time, making some notable stops along the way. But then we're going to get back into what you're talking about there, Forrest, with regard to indigenous American legends, because again, the indigenous American legends are very important to me. I do think you're correct. There is some ethnocentrism, and it's very unfortunate. Some of my other work I do with the Seven Ages Research Associates, which is a team I co-founded, we look explicitly at archaeology in North America, well, all around the world, but we work in North America. And one of the things we try to overcome is, the limited perspective that through our little narrow cultural lens, we as humans, no matter where you're from, tend to project onto a subject. But again, this happens all too often with Sasquatch. And I think that if we establish a certain history before we get over into pre-Columbian American accounts and ideas and traditions that have been passed down, we're going to start seeing some rather remarkable delineations and some also very interesting patterns, I think, emerge, especially as it relates to the idea of the North American Sasquatch. So we're going to start back in time, go all the way across the Bering Land Bridge over into North America, and kind of round it out with some more recent history and also some of those indigenous American accounts. So we got a lot to cover.
All right.
Oh my God, this is so exciting! I can't wait. So so let's start with the part that inspired you to really look into this stuff. And where was the trigger for you to get going?
Well, again, as I mentioned, I was actually inspired by the conjectures, by a number of skeptics. There's nothing in the history, as far as the historical record, that seems to account for Sasquatch. Now, I should also point out there are some other great researchers who have looked at least the last couple of centuries and have attempted to try and document the deeper history of this subject, and it's, again, being accounted for in the historical record, this primarily in newspapers. And the two researchers really that come to mind, again, Chad Arment has done incredible research. He has now, I think, put out a second volume, and I mean, it's an incredibly thick book. This is like the Bible of Bigfoot history, at least of the last 2 centuries. It's called The Historical Bigfoot. Imagine that name, very aptly titled. But in the historical Bigfoot, Chad Arment he has done yeoman's work in terms of just digging through newspaper archives. And he has tried to find every account that seems to describe, again, what we would term relict hominoids or Sasquatch, Bigfoot as they are known in the modern parlance, and present these in a very thick book that really, is I think, it's indispensable for researchers. David Paulides also, more well known for the Missing 411 book that he has written, but he also has done a book that even goes a little further back than Arment, but features a lot of the same sorts of accounts, and he obviously has done a lot of searching for this kind of information too. Now, as far as what really got me thinking about this, there is an unsung hero in, what would you call it, Sasquology? I don't know. Myra Shackley. Again, I have a love for archaeology, and Myra Shackley is still around, but she's no longer active in Bigfoot research. She, I think, actually is, if anything, an Anglican priest, I think, now. But Myra Shackley is and was an archaeologist, and in the 1980s, she wrote a book which they changed the title of. I think it had initially been called Still Living, Yeti Sasquatch and the Neanderthal Enigma. But then they retitled it and they called it Wild Man instead of Still Living. But her whole contention, as the original title seemed to present, was that she thought it was possible that Neanderthals might have persisted until fairly recently, or at least until recently enough that there might have been historical accounts of them. Sorry, there's a little noise, guys. And I was fascinated by this premise because, again, keeping in mind she was working off of the idea that, well, if we want to try and understand Sasquatch, maybe we should look at Neanderthals. The thing that really fascinates me about that is the fact that she's looking at Neanderthals when really there were no other varieties of archaic humans, early hominins that were known in the fossil record apart from human. I mean, we knew about Homo erectus and, Paranthropus, but you go much further back. But in terms of those that might have coexisted alongside humans during the last ice age, during the Pleistocene, I mean, for a long time, it was just Neanderthal. Now, since then, we, of course, have discovered the Denisovans. We also know of Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores.
Yes.
We actually also have some unrecognized varieties of hominins, which have, at very least, fragmentary fossil remains have turned up in a few instances. And one example is known as the Penghu jaw fragment that was found off the Taiwanese coast a few years ago. It appears to be a Pleistocene era fossil jaw fragment, but it's not a recognized variety of hominin. And Chris Stringer, who I believe works with the Max Planck University, actually looks at this and says, if this is Denisovan, they don't look anything like we thought they would look like. But I mean, this probably isn't Denisovan. So it leaves open the possibility that there were maybe indeed fairly recently other varieties of humans, early humans, that existed. I mean, maybe until as recently as when the actual migrants that came across the Bering Land Bridge and first arrived in North America were making their way towards the end of the Pleistocene. Now, again, I'm kind of giving the background here. Myra Shackley in the 1980s focused in on Neanderthals. Since she wrote her book on this, I mean, we've had all different kinds of other potentials as far as early archaic humans that might have been around until fairly recently, and that could also account for some of the reports of Sasquatch-like creatures throughout history. And that's really fascinating to me. So I would like to, picking up kind of with her research, I'd like to kind of lead off really with a quote from her from that book. This written in 1983, the year I was born, guys. I'm dating myself right now,
Wow.
This is the quote that she gave us, and this is a wonderful one. She says, "The very ubiquity of wild men is suspicious, and there is considerable similarity between themes and characters in the mythology of peoples widely separated in space and time. Many theories have been evolved to account for this, allowing for the presence in every society of occasional genuine monsters," in other words, she says, giants, genetic freaks, and so on. "It is possible to argue that all wild man stories are merely myths and therefore untrue, and that societies borrow the myths from each other, as was certainly the case with Greece and Rome. But it is difficult," she continues, "it is difficult for us to," hold on, where are we here? Let me find my spot. Okay. "It is difficult for us to account for the fact that similar stories appear in different continents, unless you postulate some common heartland from which the story is diffused, an idea contrary to modern anthropological thinking. Another possibility, however, is that all societies create wild men because outside their own inhabited or explored territories, there always lie unfamiliar regions which hearsay and travelers' tales will populate with strange, unidentified creatures. Some of these creatures," she concludes, "will be mythical, the product of the vivid human imagination, but others may be based on genuine sightings of unknown and unclassified species." Right there, Dr. Shackley she encapsulates it all, because when we go through history, we have to be really careful, because the idea of the traveler's tales, people in the early eras of history where they were just starting to travel to other continents and meet with people from other cultures.
Yes.
They are often described in the parlance of their day through cultural lenses. And this coming back to what you were talking about, Forrest. And so we can't just look at every description of a purported wild person and say, well, look, there's a Sasquatch. More often than not, these descriptions are of people. Shackley was hyper aware of that back in 1983, as had been other researchers before her.
And we encountered that stuff as well when we were covering Roanoke. It's the very same thing about the people that they were meeting when they came to.
Absolutely. I mean, again, that's just in like the late 1500s. That we're having this meeting of cultures.
Right.
And in fact, actually, earlier accounts, from the Vikings, right, in Leif Erikson's saga, when he comes over. The Vinland sagas, rather, and he comes over and he meets the Skraeling, which were the indigenous inhabitants of North America. Look at how they were described. Now, again, this is a great example of where a lot of people have fallen into that trap. They have taken that early account, of Vikings sailing over and reaching North America and encountering indigenous residents, and you've seen speculations that people have put all over the internet about, were these Sasquatches that the Vikings encountered? No. They just encountered people that they were unfamiliar with, people that looked different from them, but that were nonetheless undeniably Homo sapiens sapiens, not Sasquatch. So again, you do see that. That's one of the shortcomings, really of, I think, a lot of modern attempts at trying to establish a history for these kinds of creatures. Interesting side note, and I'll be brief. That idea apparently originates, the whole idea of Vikings meeting Sasquatch. It originated from a book written back in the 1970s by Peter Byrne. It's called Bigfoot, Man, Myth, or Monster, or The Search for Bigfoot, rather, was the title. But although people point out that idea was first raised in that book, anyone who's read that book will see that Peter Byrne said unequivocally these were Native Americans that were encountered, not Sasquatch. So he tried to dispel the myth right from the outset. Unfortunately, maybe people didn't finish the book and they kind of ran with that. But again, so Shackley kind of tells us what to watch out for, what to be careful about. And so we'll preface this conversation by saying, again, we have to be really careful. Maybe not every instance throughout history of a description of a wild person represents a Sasquatch. Some of them possibly do. I want to look at some mythology. I also want to look at some contenders that might actually represent good evidence of relict hominoids tonight. And a really good place to begin. Let's go all the way back. I really think. Go ahead.
Just had a quick question here, and somebody else piped up in the chat. Could you please explain to us and our audience what the importance of with the Denisovans? And I think Scott and I had mentioned them briefly when we covered Göbekli Tepe, because now you're talking about 10,000 BC or 9,500 BC, 10,000 years ago and more, and a possible confluence of different, maybe subspecies of Homo sapien or something different. So yes, could you explain, like in a very general term, what do you mean by Denisovan?
So Denisovans are essentially a hominin group. People would be probably more familiar with the expression hominid, but in recent
that was the other thing I was going to have you explain to us, because I know there's slight differences in that one is a little more authentic or accurate in its description.
Yeah,
but we're used to saying the other one.
We can kind of break all these down, because I should probably also offer a brief explanation of the idea of relict hominoid, because we've got hominin, hominid, hominoid. Yes. It can get confusing. So as far as the Denisovans, again, this was a fairly recently discovered, essentially they are Neanderthal-like. They are kindred, close cousins of Neanderthals. The reason that we identify them as being different is because at the type site for their discovery, Denisova Cave in the Altai region of Russia, we find essentially there was a fossil fingertip, that was designated having belonged to woman X, as she was called. To extract mitochondrial DNA so that it can be sequenced actually required essentially the virtual destruction of this sample. But there was successful sequencing, which unequivocally determined this to be a different variety of archaic human from Neanderthals. So the significance is that for a long time, we only thought that humans and Neanderthals existed as recently as the Pleistocene. It was once thought that around 25,000 years ago, Neanderthals died out in Europe. Now we've pushed that back, and we think that the most recent existence of Neanderthals would have been maybe in the neighborhood of about 55,000 years ago. Now, on that point, I'll also point out that most of the recovered evidence, the actual fossil remains that we use to base that idea off of, when Neanderthals went extinct, they're found in caves. And of course, there's the famous term caveman. That, of course, no doubt because, of course, we find a lot of, early human ancestor remains. And actually, these weren't just ancestors. They were contemporaries of Homo sapiens sapiens, because Homo sapiens sapiens, just like us, we existed alongside Neanderthals and apparently Denisovans as recently as the last ice age, or the epoch known as the Pleistocene. Now, here's the thing. We also probably interbred with Neanderthals, and in likelihood Denisovans too. There's evidence in modern human populations in our DNA that we have carried all this time that shows that we actually interbred with those early human types. And although they were different from us in terms of their genetic makeup, they were close enough that actual successful interbreeding occurred, which is fascinating to me for a number of reasons. One being, of course, that there are traditions all over the world involving Sasquatch kidnapping humans for what purpose, right? And this gets into sort of controversial territory, the idea of interbreeding. But again, we can already look back at our fossil, now extinct, presumed extinct hominin types, and we can see that it actually happened as recently as maybe, at least 55,000 years ago. But back to the caveman thing for a moment. Again, my whole contention is that's going to be an environment that's going to be conducive to the preservation of remains where fossil formation can occur. It doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, and this is just my layman's opinion, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there might not have been Neanderthals, Denisovans, or others that maybe actually lived longer than the fossil remnants that we have uncovered actually indicate, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, it's fascinating to me, and I wanted to clear this up when you're talking about the jawbone fragment, and that I think when people say it was seems to be proven now anthropologically that there was a 9-foot tall, a 3 meter tall ape-like creature, Gigantopithecus. And is
Mhm.
it Black Eye or Blackie? How do you
Blackie,
say
yeah.
it?
Gigantopithecus blackie. Yeah, there were actually
Right.
two varieties. In fact, there was a subspecies that also existed around modern-day Pakistan, but the one that we're talking about was a
Yeah.
Eurasian ape species known to exist, recognized in the fossil record. Yes.
Okay, interesting, because when we first covered that, and that was news to us, first of all. Secondly, we weren't sure if we were pronouncing it Black Eye or Blackie, but we'll go with Blackie with the I on the end. And just that because I think people jumped to the conclusion that they discovered a full skeleton, which they had not. They were able to extrapolate the size of this thing by the fragment of jawbone, and just how large a molar was, like 3 times the size of a human molar, I believe.
Yeah.
And that from that, though, they know that this thing existed. That's not in question. That you can have a 9-foot tall ape-like creature.
That's right. Yes. And in fact, there are other early archaic human types that at various times in various places also went through periods where they were larger. Paranthropus comes to mind. There are fairly consistent fossil recoveries of Paranthropus from parts of South America that appear to indicate that they might have been as tall as maybe 7 feet. And actually, there are some today. Cliff Barrickman, of course, of Finding Bigfoot fame. I mean, he is very much of the mind that Bigfoot, as we know it today, could actually be a surviving relict population of Paranthropus. So that brings us, of course. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just quickly want to say, because I learned it while we were talking about the show and what we were going to be doing here. I looked up the word relict, which I had not heard. R-E-L-I-C-T. I love this definition. A surviving species of an otherwise extinct group of organisms. Also, a remnant of a formerly widespread species that persists in an isolated area. The other one I like, which is like the third, it's like 3B on the definition. This is great. Just something left unchanged. Something left unchanged. I love that. But yeah, so I just wanted to explain that, because I love that word relict, R-E-L-I-C-T. It's a very cool word.
Well, I do too, and I appreciate you, explaining that, Scott, because again, I've actually had people write to me and say, I, love your commentary on all this. I just can't stand, though, when you mispronounce relic and hominid. And I'm like, okay, let's break this down. So yes, relict, again, an animal believed to have once existed, thought extinct, but which might have persisted until modern times. Hominoid, a little different from a hominin, which is essentially the modern parlance, for what we once kind of called hominid. But a hominoid is essentially something resembling one of the anthropoid apes, which would include humans, our great ape cousins, right? And also now believed to be extinct archaic hominin types like Neanderthal and Denisovans. So something essentially that's human-shaped, something that shouldn't be alive today, that we would expect to have only seen, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years ago, but which still exists today. My contention is that at very least some data in the historical record does support this hypothesis, the recent survival of relict hominoids. That's what we're talking about. I think we've got all the nomenclature out of the way, guys.
Yeah, we have. I'll try not to derail you again.
It's important, because I think a lot of us will hear these terms and you kind of think maybe you aren't paying attention. Certainly, we hear so many terms in the course of our day. But knowing the definitions of them really puts it in context, because these are the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about. And to understand those, then you get it really helps out your larger understanding of these topics.
Well, it certainly does. And again, this is the other thing. I have to also, mention my friend and colleague, Matt Pruitt. He's of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. He's also done independent research for a number of years, formerly with the Bigfoot Field Research Organization. But I mean, Matt is arguably the most eloquent speaker on this topic, and I love every opportunity I have to get together and talk with him. And again, something that Matt's really worked hard for years to try and do, and which I hope to try and do, is to raise the bar on the discussion, to use not just big words just to sound science-y. Really, the intention is to try and phrase what we're discussing in the proper context, in the proper terminological context, place it in the proper historical context, so that we are having an intelligent, informed discussion about this possibility, rather than, I seen him, he was out there and he's stunning,
Yeah.
Because that's been the argument that's been waged against Sasquatchery really for decades, and in fact, the same applies to UFOs. I remember the late Stephen Hawking, respect him though I did, talking about, if UFOs represented aliens, which we can immediately rule out, he would say, why would they come to Earth and only present themselves before cranks and weirdos? Well, if we raise the bar on the discussion and we use this kind of terminology, that we phrase this in proper anthropological and zoological and biological terminology, and put it in the right historical context, this may actually help us win some points in terms of furthering the idea that, okay, this isn't just something that crazy people claim to see, liars and hucksters, right?
Right. And again, we harp on this quite a bit, but I think it's relevant and accurate. It's that academic hubris you see. Yeah. And then when you get into, that's why, you look into, these stories are so much more about, or just as much about, the human beings that study them as the things that we're studying, in that so much of it, as you brought up in the in your introduction, just how much has to do with personality. And you can look at what's being taken serious and what isn't by the person and the ad hominem attack on their character, as you said, because of the things that they're willing to consider. So you look at Jeff Meldrum or Grover Krantz in the day, who started off as a skeptic on all of this, and later turned convinced. I believe it was the dermal ridges on a print that he found, which is like, wow, either somebody is going to just unbelievable technical capability to fake this stuff for whatever reason, or this is real. And it started to change his mind. And so and it's also a little bit cultural. You see the Russian scientists in locomotion and their biologists taking it seriously, especially around the PGF. And they realize, like, boy, you know what? You Americans are not going to be satisfied till you've killed one and it's in your office. And no film, no print, not even hair, anything else. Maybe some scat nowadays, because there could be DNA with it. But even then, it's possibly inconclusive, that you're not going to have one until you have one in a cage or you're dissecting it. And then it's going to even cause a ruckus,
Indeed. And again, I recognize the necessity for collecting a specimen that can be, that can serve as the type specimen and can be thereafter referenced. But it also really troubles me, the idea that we got to go and shoot and kill one. I mean, I guess there's a humanitarian, kind of vein that I tend to operate in. Call me unrealistic. I don't like the idea, though, of going out there and killing something that we don't even know what the possible population is, or if they exist right now. Yeah. And if they are so, infrequently seen, I mean, I can't help but think that there's a very small population, barely above capable of maintaining a breeding population, probably in decline, under pressure from both the expansion of humans and, of course, deforestation, possibly climate change is a factor. All of these issues, which, of course, are also not only making life hard for them, but, I mean, they're already critically endangered and retreating further and further away from humanity, which is going to make them even more difficult to be discovered. So my greatest fear, really, with regard to Sasquatch is if they exist. And I maintain some reservations. I'm not really all in on the idea. I know I've convinced myself. I am trying to find evidence that supports that hypothesis, but I don't believe before I've found enough evidence, right? But my worry is that one day maybe we will find unequivocal evidence. It may not be a body. Maybe it'll be, the discovery of fossil remains that can be radiocarbon dated, organic materials in close proximity, will allow us to date this, and it can be found to be, a few thousand years old. Or maybe we will find remains that are unequivocally recent, but nonetheless remains, and we won't find any further evidence beyond that. And we'll say, there was a creature, but we couldn't prove it. We couldn't get around our own hubris, like you say, Forrest, to have taken this seriously. And I think that this is a tremendous loss potential right here, because, again, we have so many questions about what it means to be human. And I promise we're going to get back into this Sasquatch discussion here in just a moment. But, I mean, let's just say this and put it out there. With the questions we have about our evolutionary past and our heritage and what it really means to be human, it should be incumbent upon us, if there's any possibility that there is something like us that exists on this world today, or maybe more than one variety in terms of species, it's incumbent upon us to try and study these, because the study of something like us that may be at a different evolutionary stage, but similar to that our ancestors went through, this could tell us incredible things about human evolution and our past and what it really means to be human. And I think that's a prospect that scares a lot of people, but I think most scientists, if faced with that possibility, would rather know than to not know. And my fear is that we will continue to allow hubris to impede our progress on this subject. And at some point, it's going to be too late. So really, I mean, it's a proactive effort on my part to try and analyze, assess, determine if there is indeed a there, and then we have to establish the biological reality. If there is one to be established, we need to discover these creatures if they exist before they are gone, plain and simple.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and just like what I always love this phrase too, which was brought up by in a weirdly remotely talk about remote connected topic, remote viewing with Russell Targ, in that you can present the data and his peers, the fellow scientists and physicists, people who on the other side of that who study do consciousness studies. They don't mind the data. It's not the raw data that they mind. It's the implications of that data. And like you said, you could present something, well, here's some DNA that doesn't really line up with anything. What does this mean? Here's some, here's something completely new that we haven't considered. What are the implications of that? What else is lurking out there that we may not have considered or don't give any credence to because it's just too way out there for scientific mainstream study?
Oh, certainly. And again, I would say a couple of things. You don't know until you go looking for it. But also, and people always laugh when I say this, there were no Denisovans until there were Denisovans.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Right.
You see what I'm saying? Again,
Yeah.
I mean, and I get a variety of responses to saying that, but I mean, my whole contention is there was no, Homo floresiensis until there was Homo floresiensis. And again, this is what's fascinating to me about Myra Shackley's research in the 1980s. Prior to the discovery of the Denisovans, or Denisovans, as they might say in Europe. Again, I've heard both pronunciations. They both equally appear to, see usage. Again, prior to the discovery of the Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores. So she was working with what was known in the anthropological record and the fossil record at the time, but now we have a number of other species that are qualifiers for these relict hominoids. So I would take it a step further and say, are there possibly those which we haven't found in the fossil record at all, which might account for some of these descriptions? So with that said, I think maybe the best place to start, in truth, is one of the earliest and most widely recognized actual forms of written narrative that we actually have in the historical record, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I would hesitate to call Enkidu, the wild man that's represented in this story, a Sasquatch. But I think it's important, if we're going to have this discussion, to recognize that one of the earliest, actually the earliest recognized epic narrative, that we have in written form, not just an oral tradition, one that was actually committed to early writing. This actually has a wild man. And so back to Myra Shackley's point about the ubiquitousness of the wild man throughout history, it goes all the way back to some of our earliest known writings. And I'll refer to some notes I have here. Of course, as we begin the Epic of Gilgamesh, the people of Uruk are kind of being oppressed, right? It doesn't really exactly elaborate on what the state of oppression is, but they appeal to the god Anu for aid, and what ends up happening is Anu hears their grievances, and Aruru is thereafter summoned to create what's called a Zikru. Now, there's some division on what exactly this means. Generally, Zikru, that word is translated to mean either reply or response, so we could call this the reply of Aruru. But in essence, what happens is that, and what they actually state, most translations would actually, and I'll quote from it here, that the Zikru would be equal to Gilgamesh's stormy heart. In other words, we're going to create something that can match the warrior king Gilgamesh. And so from a pinch of clay, Aruru tosses this clay into the wilderness, and out of it is born the wild man Enkidu. We, of course, can recognize certain similarities, of course, in the Christian Bible of the idea that, from clay, man is created. The Hebrew Book of Formation also contains passages talking about the creation of a man from mud, i.e. a golem. So, you see certain aspects of these traditions mirrored here. But I'll share a passage from the translation that I've worked with on this. And again, keep in mind, at times I will refer to other translations of some of the historical texts that we'll look at. But to quote from a passage here that describes Enkidu, in the wilderness she created valiant Enkidu, born of silence, endowed with strength by Ninurta. His whole body was shaggy with hair. He had a full head of hair like a woman, His locks billowed in profusion like ashnan. He knew neither people nor settled living, but wore a garment like sumukan. He ate grasses with the gazelles and jostled at the watering hole with the animals. As with animals, his thirst was slaked with mere water. Now, Sumukan, of course, was the god of wild animals, and this is intended by most scholars. They believe this intends to convey that he wore animal skins like the god Sumukan was often depicted as wearing. But nonetheless, again, this description is quite interesting to me because he is described as being covered with shaggy hair.
Mm-hmm.
Further passages describe how when people approach the watering hole and see him, they are frightened by his appearance. Now, if he were just a guy, one would imagine they wouldn't probably be very frightened by Enkidu, but they are very frightened by him. And of course, as we know, the story goes that he is introduced to a woman who tames him in 7 days, and then he's brought to civilization and he meets with Gilgamesh. And at first it's a clash, but they become, of course, the best of friends.
Right.
Fascinating to me that, again, this epic, known to modern scholars to have probably been written between maybe 1300 and 1000 BC. And it's describing, again, what we could really call, if not a Sasquatch, and I would hesitate to say that that's what this is. This, of course, this epic tale incorporates a number of different elements that are very fantastic, right? And so with all the elements, swimming to the bottom of the sea, going to visit, a man who can live forever up Napishtim, all of these different elements, to say that, well, one of these represents something real and everything else is, of course, just myth and folklore. Obviously, we have a problem there. So my intention here is not to say this is Sasquatch. It is to say the wild man archetype has been with us since some of our earliest instances of writing. Okay.
Yeah.
We certainly see that with Gilgamesh, but now to come over to a more, what we might deem a more historical account. Fast forward to around 475 BC. And among some of the earliest records that I have found, which appear to convey a historical account of a wild man, this one I found in what's called the Fangjianzi, or the Annals of Fangjian County. And the account here relates a occurrence that would have transpired during what was known as China's Warring States period, a time of military reform that began around 475 BC. And according to Han Dynasty historian Sima Qin, this, of course, a historical historian, and lasting probably up until about 256 BC. The account that I found describes a savage that was brought before the emperor of the Western Zhao as a tribute. And the savage, as it was described, was apparently about 3 meters tall. So yet again, Forrest, if you recall, you're describing a 9-foot tall Eurasian ape species, Gigantopithecus. Well, a 9-foot savage covered in hair was brought before the emperor of Western Zhao as a tribute. They said it had a very hairy body. It had a peculiar wide mouth. And that also is a feature that throughout time we continue to see in descriptions of even modern Sasquatch in North America.
Right.
Now, what's really interesting is that Fangjian, okay, and I'm probably butchering some of the pronunciation of these names, so please, especially Chinese speakers,
just send the emails to us, folks. We're used to them.
Exactly, yes.
And we'll get around to them once we learn Chinese.
Yeah. But Fangjian, or simply Fang County, and I can see why they would maybe abbreviate that. It lies in the northwestern corner of Hubei province. And this is a very forested, a lot of stony cliffs and caves in this region. There is an actual cave in Hubei province to this day, which is called Yeren Cave. Yeren, Wild Man Cave.
Oh.
Yeah. And of course, Yeren, or Yeren, is the term that we use today for the Chinese wild man or Sasquatch equivalent in that part of the world. So it's interesting to me that going all the way back to the Warring States period, we have accounts of alleged capture of these wild people, these Yeren, in China. Now, in 1976, a Commune Party secretary, yet again in that very same part of the world, observed what he described as a wild man in the region. He said it fled carrying a small pig. The following year, another woman from Fangjian also reported that she observed such a creature while it ate bamboo shoots. Now, again, what I'm pointing out here is that here's the description in history. Here is the existing cultural mythos involving the Yeren and caves and things named after them. And then modern sightings as recently as 1976 and 1977. Probably there are some even more recent than that, where people have said that they've seen these things. And I believe that the reports from the 1970s were actually carried in the New York Times, no less. So those are some of the earliest ones, but now let's skip ahead to the 300s BC. We have, of course, roughly coinciding with the states of Qin and Yan defecting as independent kingdoms, a statesman and poet, and he's fairly significant, Ku Yan of the state of Chu. He also had been aware of what were known as mountain ogres, and he actually wrote about these in his poetry from this period, these mountain ogres or these savages, which he wrote about from time to time. Now, a lot of historians have pointed out the fact that, I mean, there's this period where we don't hear about wild men any longer up through, the Middle Ages. And if they existed, even though we have, of course, the appearances of wild men, woodwoses or Vudavasa, as they're sometimes called, in the heraldry of the Middle Ages, wild men, in other words, were often depicted in art, but there were very few historical accounts that seemed to describe them. Not the same in China. Again, here we have from the 12th century in China, another case that I would like to bring to the table here. In the Yu Minglu, or the Records of the Hidden and Visible Worlds, this attributed to the author Liu Yiqing. He was a compiler of stories who visited China in the early 4th century. I came upon a translation by Xinjun Zhang, where he takes the Yu Minglu and he translates this very interesting account, which would have probably occurred between maybe the 200s and the late 500s. Liu Yiqing reports that there are things like people in the mountains and rocks in Dongchang County, which are covered in hair and wear no clothing. These creatures communicate with whistling and attack humans by throwing rocks at them. Now, you two, I'm sure, are familiar with the indigenous American traditions about whistling,
right? Yep.
Rock throwing, right?
Yeah, never heard of it. It's crazy.
Yeah. Ours, of course, American version is they love Snickers bars. So probably there's a Chinese equivalent of leaving treats for them or offerings.
And the rock throwing it's so ubiquitous, by the way. It's just ubiquitous in all the encounters that seem like they have some merit to them.
Well, certainly. And, among the Iroquois, there are traditions of what they call the stone giants. We also hear about stone giants or the stone man in West Virginia. And I've wondered sometimes, there are different interpretations of what the reason for that may be. But one interpretation, and this is one of many, has at least been on my mind for some time. And that may be that they may have been associated with the actual act of throwing stones. Some say that may actually have to do something with their appearance, perhaps matted fur, perhaps rolling in sand and actually having, a kind of matted, stony appearance. I think Lauren Coleman, who has done, again, incredible work for decades in this regard, that had been one of the extrapolations of that idea that he had presented. But again, one other interpretation might be that they throw rocks, the stone man. Yeah. Now, I want to actually share the translation from Li Yiqing's original passage here, because you talked about the treat, right? Leaving a Snickers bar, Forrest. Maybe in China we should leave lobsters or other kinds of crustaceans, as you're about to hear. In the mountains of Dongchang County, there are such creatures. Their figures are like those of human beings. Their length, presumably their height, 4 or 5 feet. So not that tall necessarily. Their bodies are naked. Their hair, 4 or 5 inches long, hangs down loosely. They often live among the stones in the towering mountains. They have a husky voice but cannot speak, though they can summon each other by whistles. They often conceal themselves in the dark, so cannot be seen frequently. Once some people went to cut wood and camped in the mountains. After they went to sleep at night, the creatures appeared. Holding their children in their arms, they started a fire with stones, caught lobsters and crabs from the ravine, approached the fire beside the people, and roasted the lobsters to feed their children. Now, I'll just interject here that this translation, again, I actually did a lot of my own translations in some cases. This one I did not do. This was a translation by Xinjun Zhang, who is a modern translator and collector of these accounts from early writings like those of the Li Yiqing. But I wonder about that translation and whether or not the creatures came and made the fire, or indeed, when the campers, in this case, went to sleep, the creatures came and stood and warmed themselves by the fire. Okay. Now, and I'll offer some justification for why I've wondered about that point here in a moment, but we continue with the translation. So they bring lobsters and put them on rocks by the fire while the people are sleeping and roast these to feed their children. Well, one man had not fallen asleep. He secretly awoke the others and told them what had happened, and consequently they stood up together and made a surprise attack against the creatures. Thus, the creatures ran away and left their children there. Their voices resembled the cries of human beings. The creatures urged a group of their fellows, male and female, to hit the people with stones. They approached the people, got their children, and stopped attacking. So basically, they threw rocks until everybody backed away, grabbed their kids, and ran. Now, I got to add that I came across an account from Russian hominologist, one of the Russian researchers you guys mentioned, Dmitry Beyanov. And he talked about the traditions in the Slavic countries of the Leshy, another variety of a kind of folkloric wild man. Well, listen to this account that Dmitry Beyanov gives us. The Leshy were said to approach campfires built by lumberjacks or hunters in order to warm themselves in cold winter. And it was said that they turned away their muzzles, apparently because of the bright light. They also took care that flying sparks did not touch their hair. So here we have, yet again, a little further to the west and north, another account of a tradition involving wild men. This one, again, the modern folklorist would unequivocally place in the folklore camp. But the Leshy, it was said, would approach fires, stand with their backs to the fires, and warm the fires that lumberjacks built. Yeah. So, again, I can't help but wonder if the story we have from Dongchang County, much earlier, of course, is describing the creatures approaching a fire that campers had already built. You know, right. Incidentally, the account that was provided was that these people had gone up into the forests, I believe, indeed, to harvest lumber. So something about lumberjacks attracting Sasquatch-like creatures, huh?
Well, because you have to wonder, as I always do, how advanced are they if they are intelligent? And that many people who describe them, and that is almost a gut feeling. Of course, there's no way to measure it as we do or try to with the intelligence of animals, problem solving, their tools and things of that nature, as we did with primitive humans, and the flint tools that they could make, and the progress of how they took care of themselves. Then you wonder if they are intelligent to a degree. They are not to the point where they can make fire, and that they enjoy it. They know what it is, but they're waiting on a slightly more technologically advanced version of themselves to make the fire that they will then enjoy, because lobster's better cooked. And so but they also, they're not like wild animals in the sense that they just kind of react. They can plan. They have tactics. The one that one of my favorite stories, of course, I'm sure you're going to get to, is the incident at Ape Canyon. Where you talk about throwing stones, that's the one where it got pretty violent with the miners in the cabin, I think 7 of them, where they're lobbing massive boulders now, so much so that it was breaking the log-sized timbers of the roof and the sides of the cabin that they were in, that these guys left. And of course, what I always enjoy was the explanation was by the debunkers was that, well, it was a Boy Scout troop that were throwing pebbles because that's their tradition. And the pebbles on the roof of the cabin scared these really tough, burly miner types, and they all fled and would never go back. So, but yeah, it's well, what do you have at your disposal as missiles, rocks, and if you believe some of these YouTube clips, they're throwing small trees at people too, and uprooting them or planting them upside down as a marker. But they all feature incredible strength and a lot of intelligence, but not, they're still a few steps behind us, probably, thankfully.
Right. Yeah, that would seem to be the case. And, again, we can look at cases like, the instance that we just, reviewed there from China. Mm-hmm. Certain aspects of it, of course, maybe are worthy of being taken with a grain of salt. This could have been an account that was, based on a historical knowledge of such creatures, but that was, maybe, went through a sort of process of folklorization. I mean, often you see this kind of thing. I mean, people are like, well, look, if we're looking for hardline evidence of relict hominoids, as you propose, Hanks, then we can't be saying that, well, some of these early accounts are going to have elements of folklore kind of padded onto them. But I would say you should expect that. And let me give you an example why. We know, for example, as a result of a recent preliminary assessment that was provided by the UAP task force under the cognizance of the Department of the Navy, we know that the U.S. government has taken interest in unidentified aerial potential threats, although they don't appear to be overtly threatening. But again, they're assessing the threat potential of UAP, or unidentified aerial phenomena. For decades, it seems that unidentified aerial phenomena have been observed in our skies, at very least since 1947. I would contend, again, having looked somewhat at the proto-history of this topic, that these things have been seen since well before the end of the Second World War and the 1947, kind of shockwave that, took hold in our culture after Kenneth Arnold's sighting over Mount Rainier. But what we have seen, in addition to sightings of objects and knowing very little else about these objects than the fact that they are sighted from time to time, that they behave very strangely, and that they seem to be able to do things that our current understanding of aviation, aerospace, and physics even can do. What we know apart from that is very little. And the human tendency, in the absence of evidence, to craft narratives around things in order to fill in the blanks, is all too prevalent. We don't even have to go into a far out topic like the idea of what UFOs are and whether they have exotic origins to find examples of this. You could talk to anybody who observes, a car accident or, a shoplifting incident. Every person you talk to is going to have a slightly different version of the story. And after 2 weeks, if you go back and talk to the primary witness, they'll tell you things that, I just remembered that when we were there, and I didn't tell you this the first time. The human memory has, and in fact, psychological studies show that the human memory not only has a tendency to, it often does update. And we tend to add layers of memory onto things that were actually observed. With UFOs, we now have this mythos of crash wreckage retrievals and the back engineering and reverse engineering of captured flying saucers, treaties between the Eisenhower administration and the UFOs and the extraterrestrials engaging in, widespread abduction of as much as, 10 to 20% of the U.S. population, or the world populations for that matter, secret battles beneath Dulce in, New Mexico, and all this sort of stuff. My point is, we know that there are objects, okay? We know that our government looks at them, and humans for decades have piled stories onto that, trying to interpret it and trying to kind of rationalize it and trying to understand, why are they here? What are they doing? What are their intentions? Right. And it often ends up sounding a lot more like something from a Robert Heinlein or even a Stephen King novel than it does what it might actually represent. So the idea that certain mythological elements would be, piled onto some of these accounts from, again, going all the way back to, maybe the 400s AD or even the 400s BC in China, you could expect that, especially after hundreds of years, since with UFOs, it's only taken decades for us to do the same thing.
Right. Now, I want to bring up an interesting point because it is connected to that, in that we had talked about Mark Evans, who has been studying the Yeti and looking into that and trying to combine the folklore aspect of it with actual scientific findings, specifically DNA. And I hope to talk about him in a little bit. But one thing that is interesting in that, if you look at, his point being is that you look at Homo floresiensis. I put too many consonants in there, but it's the little people from the island of Flores, right? Well, it's here's what's interesting about that aspect of it. There have been folkloric tales from the native elders for generations about little people that some have seen. So when you have Homo floresiensis, and it hasn't been around for a very long time, but there are still surviving stories about them. And the facts may be off, but just the fact that they believe that little people existed, and we're talking, 3 to 4 feet tall. And then there's a gap of them existing, but the stories and folklore still existing. But nobody taking that seriously because they think it's just folklore and tall tales handed down you tell your children. But it turns out there's some credence to that, to these local stories. And then you should take that and look at the rest of hominid cryptozoology in a more serious light with less skepticism.
Well, certainly. And, to that point, I'll just add, of course, yes, you're right. With regard to Homo floresiensis, it wasn't lost on even some hardline anthropologists that there are existing traditions of, again, what we would, in the West, we generally know this as the name Orang Pendek.
Yes.
The little man of the forest. But,
right.
Indigenous names for that are simpler. They just call it gugu, which I find really interesting because gugu, again, is described as being a bipedal, small ape-like creature, which is essentially like what the fossil representations of Homo floresiensis appear to represent. But you also have, in addition to Gugu, you have nearby, you have ideas, for instance, the Ebugogo, which I believe is maybe, I think that's going to be on the island of, oh gosh, I'm trying to think. Arthur C. Clarke, where did he have a home? Sri Lanka, right? So,
I think so, yeah.
so I believe that the term there for their traditional wild man is Ebugogo. Then in Africa, there's the Agogwe. So etymologically, I'm fascinated with the fact that there are similarities, but that's not all. Traditions, okay, on the island of Flores with regard to the Gugu or the Orang Pendek describe the creatures all being rushed into a cave, and they set fire to the cave and they were all killed inside the cave. The exact same tradition exists in Sri Lanka with regard to their variety of wild man. In fact, in North America, the exact same tradition exists with regard to Lovelock Cave in Nevada about the called destruction of the Titicaca. And David Weatherly and I have had coffee numerous times and talked about this, because David has gone up and down the Pacific coast and found additional references to cultural traditions of, hominins being killed in the cave. Now, again, the problem with this is that this is clearly what folklorists would recognize as a cultural myth. But again, it's interesting to me, just like flood myths or anything else, where does this tradition stem from? The idea of these human-like creatures being chased into a cave, a fire set at the cave, and they are killed. And again, the similarities in the name. I mean, is it all entirely just folklore? And is this the death nail for the idea? Again, the hardline anthropologists would say maybe not, since we have fossil record of these Homo floresiensis, these hobbits, which are not unlike what are described even today by some of the islanders. So one of the interpretations is that if these creatures don't still exist, maybe an actual cultural memory of Homo floresiensis has endured. I would like to think, of course, especially in light of the fact that there are some reports, and again, in terms of the historical discussion we're having, Marginoli in I believe probably the 16th century gave us accounts of, little hairy people in this part of the world, which some people think might have been Gugu. Others are a little more hesitant and worried that these might be travelers' tales, and they're just describing some of the indigenous residents. So yet again, we've got to be careful with these things. But again, it is notable that there were historical accounts too that described Gugu, as well as the modern idea of Orang Pendek.
Now, if you want to extrapolate that to larger myths that are pervasive, and speaking of Gilgamesh and the Old Testament idea of a large global flood, even extending into, Scott could correct me here, but we studied it with the Pima Indians, the Pima Native Americans in the American Southwest having a flood origin story where a young couple takes animals and makes a giant tar ball that they survive in, like a raft or an ark. And now I believe there's evidence, some archaeologists are finding, for the evidence that Gilgamesh may have existed, in that the legend was, I believe, when he died, he was buried they diverted the river, he was buried there, put the river back over him so he would not be disturbed. Now they think they may have found a burial of some, again, one of the ancient Sumerian kings, at least, or somebody from the kings list that was very important, because it was a lot of effort to do that Gilgamesh may have existed. And also evidence now with archaeology that and geology that a great flood most likely took place of some kind. And then we have legends of that. So is it something that's happening that ancient peoples remembered and have passed down through oral tradition and then eventually written tradition? Or is it just, it seems almost more woo-woo to say that we've all had a collective memory of something that never occurred, and it just ends up in our folklore and tales. But somehow it's pervasive around the world with all peoples and most cultures.
Right.
It just sounds like something happened, and it resonates with everything. We talked about Göbekli Tepe, and it may have been partly due to a comet that struck and was devastating, and the peoples from then on said, well, we better get in line here and start praying to the gods and have some reverence, or this is going to happen again, because they remembered how devastating it was last time. And then you talk to people who say, well, that's, there's no proof of that. That can't be, there's no evidence of a large comet passing by and causing damage. But there are Chinese records of it from, maybe thousands of years before it was written then. And they had memories of it. So there's too many connections, I think, to just dismiss it as common coincidence, global folklore, that somehow we just come up with the same stories.
Certainly, I agree. We could have a long conversation about the evidence of, cataclysmic floods at the end of the terminal Pleistocene and the relationship with comets, because, I've actually done some work at archaeological sites with the actual academic excavators who are probing that mystery and collecting proxy data in support of the idea of a Younger Dryas impact hypothesis.
Yeah.
In the form of rare earth metals that are found in abundance in the stratigraphy that coincides with that period in history. But that is, unfortunately, guys, a conversation for another time.
Indeed.
Except you also took a lot of flack. I remember there was a big dust up that you handled with such aplomb and gentlemanly courtesy about the giants at Lovelock. And I believe it was, I don't know if we want to mention him by name, but another skeptical writer, you could say. And it was about some details that they didn't agree with because, of course, nothing that unusual could possibly be real.
I'm sympathetic to the skeptics who see a couple of problems with the gross misinterpretation of these, and the attempt to try and kind of pile them all together and say it's all the same thing. One is, of course, often a failure to understand or a simple overlooking of the indigenous American interpretations of these sites and traditions, which really must remain paramount if we're going to really frame this in the proper context. And then, of course, also there's the pseudo-archaeological aspect of this, where unfortunately a lot of people are trying to find, and their intention is simply to go out there and find evidence of things that smacks in the face of modern contemporary archaeology. Now, what's really confusing for a lot of people is I maintain an interest in all these sorts of things, but I also work with serious archaeologists, and I don't advocate pseudo-archaeological theories. And again, the archaeologists that I work with are, again, very strict by the books, well-educated, and frankly renowned in their communities for the work that they do. And nonetheless, what we also are beginning to see is that certain ideas that were once deemed fringe, i.e., for instance, the idea of an impact hypothesis in association with that cool reversal period called the Younger Dryas toward the end of the Pleistocene, we're actually seeing more and more scientific verification for this. And I've spoken with, for instance, a friend of mine, Dr. Chris Moore from the University of South Carolina Education System, who has done incredible work. He's a geoarchaeologist, but he has, conducted numerous field seasons of excavations at sites like White Pond in South Carolina. Andrew M.T. Moore, the immediate past honorary president of the Archaeological Society of America, who I've spoken with and who also conducted excavations for years at sites in Syria like Abu Huraira. Again, I could go down the list of ongoing studies that have recovered proxy data in support of the idea of an impact that occurred around this time. But again, having spoken with all of these archaeologists, and these, again, not fringe theorists by any stretch of the imagination, many of them were skeptical initially, and they had to come around and say, there seems to be a growing body of evidence, and at this point, maybe even an abundance of it, that points to an idea that we would have initially deemed unlikely. But with further scientific verification, we're now having to say, we need to not only entertain this possibility, we need to actually say that this is a very likely scenario. So again, not to derail the conversation here, but we can talk all night about archaeology too. And again, something that I think that is often missed by many skeptics is that, sometimes an idea may seem unlikely, but the fact that it seems unlikely does not inherently make it unlikely. And sometimes good scientific evidence in support of seemingly unlikely ideas later comes back around, and then you have something like general relativity. Now, last anecdote here. Einstein was incredibly unpopular with his theory when it first came on the scene. And there were 100 philosophers and mathematicians and physicists that gathered together, and they signed a petition showing their distaste for relativity. And Einstein famously quipped, and I'll paraphrase here, "If I'm wrong, do the math. But signing a petition, I don't care if there's 100 or 1,000 of you, that ain't going to change the math." And again, the justification for his theory, we're still seeing with, again, the discovery and the confirmation of gravity waves. Let's go down the list of all the ways that relativity continues to be verified. So again, many times throughout history, novel ideas seemed unlikely at first, but they have lasted the test of time. And some of those we're discussing that may also prove in the eventual sense to do the same, if we're lucky.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, but Forrest, I got to come back over to, like you were talking about, for instance, Gilgamesh and the archaeological justification for the existence of Gilgamesh. Again, there is some archaeological support for the actual existence of this king. Okay. And another area of history where we have a mythic tale, an epic legend for which there is some archaeological justification is Beowulf. And here again, much like the story of Gilgamesh, we have another, example of epic literature from early times that also features essentially a wild man, although there's a little bit of debate about what exactly the nemesis of Beowulf, Grendel, actually was. But let's just go right to Seamus Haney's translation here. He'll give us his translation from the Anglo-Saxon, which will help us kind of paint the picture. And to quote Haney's translation, Grendel had dwelt for a time in misery among the banished monsters, Cain's clan, whom the Creator had outlawed and condemned as outcasts. And for the killing of Abel, the Eternal Lord had exacted a price. Cain got no good from committing that murder, because the Almighty made him anathema, and out of the curse of his exile there sprang ogres and elves and evil phantoms, and the giants too who strove with God, time and time, until he gave them their reward. Now, of course, Haney's translation is fascinating for a number of reasons, and like many, it makes an unequivocal association between Cain, the biblical Cain, and Grendel. And there are some fascinating scientific papers about this that I've read, which, actually suppose that maybe some of the inspiration for the epic of Beowulf had actually been drawn from something like the Book of Enoch, and that the scribes, who had recorded the story, it may have been an earlier cultural story, but that the scribes who recorded it may have been familiar with something like the Book of Enoch, and that certain themes that are recognized in both do appear. But now I want to come around to a lengthier description that's given, because actually in the story, after the battle, the epic clash between Beowulf and Grendel, and of course Grendel's arm is literally ripped from his body, and he runs off screaming and apparently, bleeds to death and dies, much to the angering of his mother.
Right.
But shortly after the death of Grendel, we have the following passage, again referring to Haney's translation here, where he writes, "I have heard it said by my people in Hull, counselors who live in the upland country, that they have seen two such creatures prowling the moors, huge marauders from some other world. One of these things, as far as anyone ever can discern, looks like a woman," and this is the famous, and I love this gives me chills, this description of Grendel. "The other, warped in the shape of a man, moves beyond the pale, bigger than any man, an unnatural birth, called Grendel by country people in former days." Haney's translation goes on to say they are fatherless creatures, and their whole ancestry is hidden in a past of demons and ghosts. They dwell apart among wolves on the hills, on windswept crags and treacherous caches, where cold streams pour down the mountain and disappear under mist and moorland.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, isn't it great?
It is great. And you're reminding me of, this comes up quite a bit too, the Nephilim.
Yeah.
And then you have you have those traditions, and maybe that extends to David and Goliath, where you have a giant, a warrior, but essentially a wild beast or donkey of a man, and he just happens to be huge, but possibly something extant was existing with him, was somebody that is notably. It's not just a tall guy. I mean, you could say people in the ancient world were a lot shorter. Somebody who was maybe even 7 feet tall would stand out, as they do now. But somebody who's 10 to 15, 18 feet tall, and tales of the bed of one king, and I can't remember his name now, but his bed was reported to be 20 feet long. You have those tales permeating, and then that translating into, if you believe that, was it L.A. Lazuli? I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he does a lot of studies in kind of a biblical angle on these, with strange beasts, giants, things appearing from the Bible, and a tale from somebody, a veteran from the Iraq War, who claims that they cornered a large wild man giant about 14 to 15, 18 feet tall that killed one of their men while out on patrol, and was eventually killed by them and carted off in large cargo nets under a Chinook helicopter. So those kinds of legends exist to this day of giant wild men, but in varying forms of visage. Some more human-like, some more or beast and shaggy, some kind of somewhere in between. And certainly that's the impression I get, was that some tales that you get from people who observed them, they're much more animal-like than human, but human enough that with some of the reports, and Scott, you can correct me on this, when we did the PGF series, there was one report that was kind of famous, I think from the 60s or 70s, where a guy confronted what he thought was a female Sasquatch of some type, and he had his rifle with him. He was out hunting, but he said just the impression he got was it was too human to shoot at.
William Rowe.
That's it.
Yeah.
And we can talk more about that a little later as well, because it's a very important case in terms of establishing the historical delineations here. But yeah, to your point, William Rowe said, again, he thought, is this a person in a suit? What is this thing? If I shot it, I might have been committing murder.
Yeah, right. But that's what I'm saying, is that what's fascinating to me is that you have not just a linear evolution of both physical beings and also an evolution of folklore as it transmogrifies throughout the ages, and the tales are handed down, and some things stick and some things change, and then it boils. You're in a crucible of the same story elements and tropes and the same character ideas, but you have simultaneous evolution and maybe de-evolution and stagnation of the same types of biological creatures, and that you have human-looking giants, you have ape-like giants, you have human-looking little people, you have ape-like small people that are more like primitive humans. It's what Scott and I always find, is that everything, it's just a smorgasbord of strangeness that has always been reported and possibly still exists. Certainly.
And, when we get around to the William Rowe encounter, we're going to get to that point too here shortly. We can point out that sometimes those lines between the human-like giants and the ape-like or the monsters, they aren't necessarily so well defined. And there's been a lot of confusion about those points. Now, coming back to Beowulf, to your point, my contention would be that Beowulf is a mythology. It's a story. It's a legend, but that perhaps it borrowed, like some of the other mythological instances that we've already discussed, from actual happenings, from actual knowledge, from actual events. There have been interpretations of Grendel as having simply been a berserker, that he was essentially like a barbarian, just a person. But then again, there are other aspects of the story that don't seem to point in that direction. The apparent, even if it's superficial, similarity between Grendel and the idea of Sasquatch as we recognize it today was not lost on John Green, for instance. And I want to share a passage from John Green writing about this in his book, Sasquatch, or On the Track of Sasquatch. He wrote, one of the most startling Sasquatch stories is none other than the most important survival of ancient Anglo-Saxon literature, the Beowulf epic. The dragon in Beowulf's final adventure is outside my field of study, but the giant Grendel and his mother sound like Sasquatches. Their habit of snatching up the warrior sleeping nearest the door in the great hall whenever they were hungry is somewhat more bloodthirsty than any story the Indians tell. But there are similarities of method nonetheless, and their homes reached by diving under the water checks with a few modern reports of hairy giants diving into lakes. Now, as we can see in this passage, John Green, in mentioning the dragon, is actually pointing out the more mythical, elements, I think, of the story that certainly make this and place it, firmly in the camp of, an epic tale, a story, a fiction narrative. But with that in mind, I would like to try and again, I've written even further about this. And in fact, there's a manuscript in the works right now. I'm hoping to really expound on this, but there's a tremendous amount of research, and I've already been working on it for a few years, and who knows how many more it'll take to finish this. But this isn't all just what I do in my spare time. There's, of course, a manuscript I'm working on here.
I just cannot wait to read this, by the way. I can't believe you divulged
Yeah.
that. I'm so glad you shared that with our listeners, because
Yeah.
that's just awesome. And it's so awesome of you to come on tonight and share some of this research, which you have not published anywhere else. This is a worldwide Micah Hanks exclusive right here, a lot of this information. So thank you so much.
It certainly is. And again, full disclosure, I wouldn't have it any other way than to share it with you guys, because I have a mutual respect for the research that you guys do and the effort that you put into what you do. And so this is the perfect kind of a format to discuss some of this. But yeah, a lot of this I have never even spoken about elsewhere, and it's definitely very special to share it with you guys.
Yeah.
Awesome. In my other writings about it, in my future writings about it, I hope to also get into some of Tolkien's analysis of Beowulf and, look at what he had to say about it. But for the purposes of the conversation, let's safe it to say that there are some interesting aspects of the Beowulf story. And I'll just try to very briefly cover some of these. For instance, and this is another text where if you look at Haney's translation, you have the Anglo-Saxon alongside his translation. And so what I did was I actually did my own translations of certain passages. I'm not good enough at Anglo-Saxon. I don't profess to know any of it, but with modern translation software, you can do an awful lot. And so I did certain passages to try and see if there were words and combinations of words that might have alternative meanings. What I find is that between the different translations that have been done over the years, for instance, one of them being, of course, Haney, but also we have one that was produced. Let me see if I can find the actual name of the other production. It was one from about a century earlier. Hall's translation would be the other one that I had referenced, and I'll actually reference a passage from that here in a moment to give you an example of what I'm talking about. But there's remarkable consistency between the general terminology in these translations. And so one term that comes up in the Anglo-Saxon that's consistent, that has interested me, is the term Skeadu Genga, which essentially translates to mean night walker or shadow mover. In other words, they're describing Grendel as being nocturnal. Okay, so Grendel's larger than a man, but essentially in the shape of a man, maybe a little more beastly in appearance, and he's nocturnal. He's a shadow goer. We also have, for instance, terms that appear, or expressions, the passage, again, I'm going to quote here from Hall's translation. Well, first, let's go with Haney. Haney actually wrote a baleful light, flame more than light, as far as describing the creature's eyes. When Grendel actually appears at Heorot, and he's coming in and he's snatching up people and, devouring the soldiers, and the men who are sleeping there in the hall, and Grendel's about to, do battle with Beowulf, he describes the eyes glowing in the dim light of the hall. We go now to to Hall's translation, having heard Haney's, and Hall translates it as follows: "From the eyes of him glimmered a luster unlovely, likest to fire." Now, the reason this is interesting to me is because, again, we have reports of Sasquatch-like creatures in modern times that describe this apparent glowing of the eyes, and I'll give you a couple of good examples that Myra Shackley, who we referenced earlier, provides. From the Pamir's expedition in Central Asia in 1980, one member of the expedition, Nina Greneva, describes actually seeing one of these creatures. She said it was as close as 25 meters from her, and she maintained eye contact with the creature, of which she remembered that, quote, "the eyes were big and glowing. They were not bright, but glowing." Another account, we're told by Shackley, was provided by a former schoolmistress in Siberia named Marfa Efimonova, who said that she and her father observed a nighttime passage of a tall humanoid through a forested area, of which she said his eyes glowed like two lanterns. Now, again, I would stop short of saying Grendel is a Sasquatch, but it is interesting that he's nocturnal. He has this, what appears to be night shine. Some interpret this as being what is recognized in certain species as tapetum lucidum. It's eye shine that is resulting from a thin, reflective, highly reflective membrane within the actual eye, that when light hits it, if you've seen like a deer or a cat, even alligators, a number of nocturnal species, they actually reflect light when light hits their eye.
Yeah.
Some accounts seem to describe Sasquatch-like creatures doing this too, but there's a problem there because the tapetum lucidum does not exist in primates, with the exception of certain lemurs in Madagascar. Okay? And so it would be hard to say that Sasquatch has developed this, but if they have, if we are actually talking about some sort of a nocturnal primate that has somehow developed tapetum lucidum, I mean, that would be fascinating in and of itself, because it seems to point to a very unique adaptation where these creatures are almost living exactly the opposite of humans. Talk about a survival mechanism. Let's operate primarily when they don't. Let's come out at night when they aren't moving around. Talk about a great way to be able to remain hidden. So, I will say that there are some aspects of the Beowulf story that interest me, and those are some of them. Now, if we want to look at a more interesting historical account, let's skip ahead just a little further on down the temporal timeline from the Beowulf narrative. AD 1250, we have an Irish wild man account that appears in the King's Mirror. This is a text from around 1250 of Norwegian provenance. I'll skip right ahead to the section of the Marvels of Ireland where we have the following, gents. It once happened in that country, and now listen, the narrator actually writes this in the original document, and this seems indeed strange, as if to say, I don't know what to make of this, guys, but here it is, that a living creature was caught in the forest as to which no one could say definitely whether it was a man or some other animal, for no one could get a word from it or be sure that it understood human speech. It had the human shape, however, in every detail, both as to hands and to face and to feet. But the entire body was covered with hair, as the beasts are, and down the back it had a long, coarse mane like that of a horse, which fell to both sides and trailed along the ground when the creature stooped in walking. Now, that's a remarkably good account from 1250 of what sounds an awful lot to me like a wild person or a relict hominoid. A scholarly interpretation is that this might be some sort of a strange extrapolation on water monsters believed to exist in Irish folklore, but unless we're talking about a mer-squatch, I mean, I don't see any reference. And I actually have found at least one account from the Middle Ages around Orford where a wild man was purportedly captured swimming in a bay, and he was taken captive, even tortured. They tried to bring him to the ways of Christ, but he wouldn't capitulate from his wild ways. And when they released the wild man, he went right back into the water and went and swam away. So it's the closest thing I've found to a medieval mer-wild man, but as far as the Irish counterpart here, I mean, it just sounds like a very wild person that was captured, hirsute, and it's an interesting account, if nothing else.
Well, I talk about, so what year was that? The 1250s?
1250, yeah.
Okay, so let me throw a curveball at you. Wasn't it Marco Polo who reported meeting dog-headed men? Right. And they were well known by the Turkmen or the humans that they dealt with that were around them, and of course a very detailed description of their appearance and their customs and their behavior. Well, of course, being much like a wild dog, trying to behave as if you'd invited one into your house, just kind of crude and bumbling and not very refined, but could speak. And then when you read, it's like Marco Polo didn't seem to be everything else that he said and reported in his tales were taken to be with a lot of seriousness. And then you get to dog-headed people, and it's like, it seems a little left field, but he didn't seem to be tongue-in-cheek about it. It seemed to be reported with like, dog-head men. That's just what's out there that we came across. And what do you make of that?
It's hard to know. There are traditions in parts of, especially in the Eastern Orthodox Church that describe, dog-headed saints and things like this.
Right, yeah, sure, yeah.
This one, again, to me, seems to bespeak folklore and mythology. And it has a bit of a flair that seems to, stem from some of their travelers' tales of earlier times, prior to Marco Polo's times. But I will add to this that, there are certain similarities I'm reminded of, like, King Lycaon, and some of the Greek mythology that involves men transforming into wolves.
Right.
And hence, the idea of lycanthropy. So there are certain similarities there. Now, in modern times, we have a sort of a cultural counterpart to that, which is the dog man, right? Mm-hmm. I have a hard time putting much stock in the idea of there being an actual canine-like hominoid that exists apart from Sasquatch. And I've heard Lauren Coleman and others talk about this, and Coleman seems to be spot on with it, that, he says, I respect Linda Godfrey, for instance, who has written tremendously about this. I do too, by the way.
She's been on our show. Yeah. She's
I,
been on our show.
I think she's a fantastic researcher, but to quote or to paraphrase Lauren Coleman talking about Linda's research, he has said, I think that really she's reading into what sound to me like reports of Sasquatch. And I would have to gravitate more toward Lauren's interpretation that, maybe the dogman idea is a kind of a mythological, again, kind of padding sort of that's added on to reports of things like Sasquatch. In other words, to summarize, I share a view that I think that Coleman has espoused. I could believe maybe that there is one other kind of, humanoid type creature out there that's covered in hair, but there's a totally separate one of similar size, but that's more like a canine that, it starts to strain credulity for me.
Micah, here's the big problem is that so many of your questions and ponderings would be solved if you would just accept the paranormal. If you would just open up and let yourself just breathe into it, brother, and dive in with both feet and just accept stuff, because in all seriousness, I so much respect your approach, and as we've seen in the chat here, so many people do too. Is just you're unbiased. You're not selling anything here, especially an idea. You're presenting an academic approach to research, of serious research, which is the way you should do it. And if you have some interests, veer off here and there, explore everything, as we say, put everything on the table, see what makes sense to your own self, and don't discard the rest, but set it aside for further study later on. But spend your time pursuing what can be known. And but there are branches where you start to get into the weird. And if you believe any of these cases at all, we had a couple of great episodes with Stan Gordon, who's certainly tracked Bigfoot and the stories of Pennsylvania, of eastern Pennsylvania specifically, and what's been going on there, and just reports of is things you mentioned, eye shine, but green eye shine, creatures that are long, shaggy, hairy, but completely white furred things, albino Bigfoots of course, but also a lot of variety in them regionally. As you said in, I think, your inaugural podcast, Sasquatch Tracks, that. Oh, I'm sorry. Scott, am I not?
No, you're back. You're back. You froze up a second, but you're back.
Oh, back. Did I froze up? Okay. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
All right. Just a pause for that. In your inaugural podcast, you mentioned that there are reports of that horrible smell with the skunk ape of Florida, but in other regions, no smell at all. Never a pleasant smell, but different descriptions of possibly a multitude of subspecies in different descriptions. And now, of course, some people could be mistaken. These aren't often that close or clear. And as your guest, was it David Gordon? I'm trying to think.
David George Gordon, the naturalist.
David George Gordon. He says, like, would you try and just get good data? And I love the approach, because it was all about, like, if more people would just try to collect good data with good scientific methods, we'd understand a lot more. We'd have a better knowledge base about this. But he said, the thing I like is that you're often panicked if you see a large, hairy man in the woods that's about 6-7 feet tall running maybe beside your car. Your first thought is, like, not to get out your notebook and your camera.
Like, could you pee in this cup?
It's like, or some scat would be nice. Some scat would be terrific. I'll just leave this here and be back.
Look, I'm gonna look the other way. Just
we'll give you some privacy. Yes,
privacy. Yes, please.
Yeah, but it's interesting though, in that there you can. I guess my point is you can veer off to that where it starts to get a little more gray. It starts to get a little more folkloric and wild and weird. But I believe some of these people are describing something strange about the phenomenon. But of course I admit it's much harder and maybe not productive to take a scientific look at that, because we just don't have the tools for that.
Well, a couple of points, and again, I think that it will become fairly evident the influence that Lauren Coleman has had me over the years. You know, I've met Lauren many times, and consider him a friend, in fact, and truly a mentor in a lot of ways. Even though when I was really young, we used to correspond a whole lot more than we do now. I ran into him at an event a few years ago and everything. We got a picture taken together and hung out for a bit, but I mean, we're overdue for a serious catch up. Because he really, heck, I'd take a mustard at this point, tell you the truth. But I mean, he is someone who has had a profound influence on me in terms of the way he approaches things, from his, indigenous American interests and his, chronicling of ethnology in relation to this, to, of course, also saying, look, and he actually early on co-authored a book with Jerome Clark called The Unidentified that sort of approached a more what I would, and this is the best way I think that we could phrase this, what Jacques Vallée did with Passport to Magonia for ufology, I think really that book, Clark and Coleman writing together, they were looking at things like Sasquatch and UFOs sort of through that lens. In which case I actually find it to be an important book, but I also recognize it for what it is. And Coleman, of course, today says, I don't endorse that the premise that Jerry and I lay out in that book any longer. Coleman in more recent years, and in fact actually probably since at least the early 2000s, if not earlier, has always said, look, we should begin by looking at Sasquatch as a biological reality, and we move up the scale from there. Now, again, kind of mirroring that perspective, I would maintain, hey, I'm interested in all different claims regarding the paranormal to some extent. But I mean, as I've gotten older, I've really narrowed it down to two: UFOs, or UAP as people like calling them now, and Sasquatch, or relict hominoids. I don't necessarily see any connection between those two phenomena. Stan Gordon, who you mentioned, he has kind of long advocated that maybe there are certain crossovers. I saw a study by economists a number of years ago that saw a crossover there. But what it was that the sightings, and in terms of the geographic distribution, where sightings of Bigfoot and UFOs occur, tend to overlap. Yeah. But from an economical perspective, to economists looking at this, they say the reason for the overlap is simple. It's that people see these things, and wherever you find people, you're going to see sightings occurring, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Now, again, coming back kind of to Coleman's idea, I would say that although I'm interested in other ideas and I'm open to other possibilities, we can't explain a lot of, alleged paranormal phenomena. We don't have any understanding of the mechanism that facilitates, things like, interdimensional travel, portals, stuff like this. And so the problem I have, and that I raise, my observation, at least as far as, those who would presume that Sasquatch must be paranormal, I would say you're trying to use an unexplainable quantity to explain another unexplainable quantity. And in this case, in my opinion, and take that for what it is, but two negatives don't make a positive. Therefore, if we proceed with the possibility that there's a biological reality, and that hypothesis ends up holding true later on down the road, we will have saved a lot of time and effort and energy chasing after a phenomenon we don't understand and trying to explain it through the lens of other things we don't understand. Yeah. Because that's not going to really offer an explanation. It's just going to be more conjecture. Right. So I proceed with the understanding I have, and of course my interest in history and anthropology, and I say, let's work from that base first and make our way up from there, and hope maybe, if we're lucky, that Sasquatch will fall somewhere into that general framework, which I think that there's a very strong case to be made that it does.
Yeah, I mean, this is my interesting point, and then we'll continue on with your outline. Is that well, you could say ghosts leave evidence, other paranormal phenomenon does. Certainly, a lot of people think UFOs have, with the Delphus ring and some things left behind, radiation, scorch marks, things like that. They leave an imprint in our physical world, but more so, Sasquatch does, footprints, and this is what's odd. We've taken some very good footprints, I think, that are at the least anomalous, and not faked by a guy wearing giant carved wooden feet on his shoes, on the soles of his shoes. Some things that are pretty amazing. I believe fully in the PGF as being authentic, but it stops there. So this is the big question with a large primate that apparently a lot of people claim to have seen. we haven't really gotten any solid fur evidence or scat, and I think that was the two things that most animals leave behind. On the other hand, as you talked about in your first podcast, is that you often it took 5 years or so for a team of biologists to actually find traces of the grizzly that they were trying to study, which is a well-known creature, but just tracking a large animal is not as easy as a lot of people would like to think it is, and would use that as an excuse that it doesn't exist at all. So, but to your point, if you start with the footprints, and this is at least something that, even if you want to believe that it is interdimensional in a way, and of course that's another big diversion of belief, and that a lot of people do believe there's some element, and maybe that's why we don't ever see any further traces of one, or they're a carcass, or they're dead, or other physical traces that somehow they just kind of vaporize after a little bit, especially after a sighting. But we do have, you can't, I agree, you can't go any further with that with any kind of measurement, but they do make an imprint physically in our world that people have reported on, and you can start there. And I believe with, as you said, with good scientific principles and data gathering, start from there and then build up. And then the other stuff, maybe one day we'll get to. Maybe one day we'll understand interdimensionally, other dimensions and multiple dimensions and portals and things like that. And maybe that's how they're getting around. But until then, start with what we know.
Exactly. Yeah. Work with a basis that we can all agree upon, that we can apply scientific standards to. And, I'll quote a couple of fantastic anthropologists briefly. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, who I've, had the benefit of having ongoing dialogue with. We did a 2-part episode for the Sasquatch Tracks podcast, which I produce, about this topic. Put out about a couple of episodes every month of Sasquatch Tracks, and that's just been a delight to do with Dakota and Jeff, my wonderful co-host, to really put in tremendous amounts of effort, making that project happen, especially with my crazy schedule. But we've also had ongoing discussions with Dr. Meldrum as a part of a group of scientists who are, some of them a little more low-key than Dr. Meldrum is, but they are very much interested in this topic. And so when people say scientists don't take this seriously, that's flat wrong. There are many who, unfortunately, on account of the cultural stigmas that are applied towards Sasquatch, they are hesitant to become publicly involved, but they nonetheless absolutely maintain an interest. And of course, I respect their privacy, and their choice to remain behind the scenes for the time being. But I hope that we can engage in this dialogue in a way that they will never, they won't continue to have to feel that they must remain behind the scenes, and that maybe they can begin to engage this topic and do so feeling secure, and also with the understanding, mutually with the public, that this is recognized as something that indeed there is far more evidence perhaps in support of. It's not just a crazy idea or just folklore. And to the other side of this, again, coming back to Dr. Meldrum, he's often said, listen, there are footprints, no doubt many of them are hoaxes, but all it would take would be one footprint actually left by one of these creatures. If we could suppose that as little as one were real, then we're talking about a biological reality. And as Myra Shackley, who I will continue to reference because she was one of the fantastic females of hominology and someone who I just, again, have unending respect for with her writing and research, being one of the few archaeologists who got involved in all this, she very eloquently put it like this: myths and folklore don't leave unidentifiable footprints. Yeah. That to me is really, that's the clincher right there. I want to get into talking with you guys too a bit about some of the North American aspects of this and how we can kind of establish the history of Sasquatch in North America beyond 1958. But if you'll indulge me, may I share one more medieval account that's really interesting?
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't mind, do you?
Oh, no. Do we seem like we mind?
No, again, these are the stories you don't hear about. Not many people are familiar with, including us. And these stories give you context, and that it takes away the easy, as I said at the beginning, the easy explanation is like, well, this is a pretty modern phenomenon. It's just a bunch of hoaxers, and then we don't know about this from the past because it wasn't happening before TV and the $6 Million Man and all his popular culture that was now passing it around, which again, that fueled people's imaginations, and that's why they're seeing them now. There's nothing real to it. It's that I believe they've always been seen.
Well, and
depending on who
again,
you talk to.
yeah, and this, what I'm offering, these historical accounts, I realize that, a skeptic may, review these and say, okay, well, wonderful legends involving what we've already recognized for quite some time, myths and traditions involving wild people, but this isn't evidence of Sasquatch. I completely understand that the skeptic will generally view these through that lens. Now, there are some problems I would find with that. Of course, I think that they probably are leading with the presumption, well, we know Sasquatch doesn't exist, therefore, what could these accounts possibly entail, since we know they aren't Sasquatch, right? Again, I often hear many skeptics say we're the truly open-minded ones, and some of them actually are. I have tremendous respect for a lot of good skeptics, and there are a lot of good ones out there. I consider myself fundamentally a skeptic. I'm sure, at points that kind of comes through in this discussion because I'm not willing to unequivocally say, I know these creatures are out there, I believe. No, it's like John Keel said, belief is the enemy. I chose a long time ago to forego belief, show me the evidence. So I'm a skeptic in that regard. But I also think that on the more debunker side of skepticism, there are plenty of skeptics who are all too comfortable saying, here's what I believe or disbelieve, and now I'm going to orient my thinking around my, predisposition toward disbelief. They may not even realize they do that, but there's an ideological preponderance toward disbelief, which they filter everything through. And they'll say, well, no, I'm applying scientific methodology. Well, to the contrary, I would say you're defaulting to what seems like the safest position on this argument. Whereas actual science is being done by the Jeffrey Meldrums of the world, the Myra Shackleys of the world, the people who are going out there and putting their bums on the line, getting in the field, making castings, spending, weeks on end in the forest, talking to potential cranks, crazies, weirdos, and crackpots, but trying to get to the bottom of establishing an understanding through the accumulation of evidence. I mean, there's a real big difference between doing actual field work, going to school and studying anthropology, really trying to apply science, and then falling back on the very simple disposition of show me the evidence. I mean, you can argue that all day, and it's hard to argue against it. So I do sympathize with the skeptics in that regard, but I also think that at times, not always, but sometimes, there's a bit of intellectual laziness. Oh, well, I know what my argument is. Now you guys prove the extraordinary claims. There are many scientists who are trying to do that. These historical accounts are simply aimed at doing one thing. There have been instances where I've seen skeptics say, there's no evidence in the historical record, therefore we know it's a modern phenomena. If we look in the historical record, there are some accounts, as we're seeing here, that maybe are suggestive of a deeper history of this phenomenon. Now, another example, Bavaria, 1427, we have the account provided by Johann Schiltberger. He had essentially gone off to fight in the wars against the Ottoman Empire. He was captured. He's taken prisoner. He's held captive for a number of years, and he ends up actually in the company of the Khan of Siberia, where he essentially becomes a runner. But while he's there in Siberia, he had a rather interesting account that he shared, which he later wrote about when he returned to Bavaria, and he wrote a chronicle of his travels. And this is the account that he gives us from that period. On the same mountain, he's talking about a mountain, which is at the other edge of a desert, which they call in that region the end of the earth, which I take to be the Gobi Desert. But he says, on the same mountain, there are savages who are not like other people, and they live there. They're covered all over the body with hair, except the hands and face, and run about like other wild beasts in the mountain, and also eat leaves and grass and anything they can find. The lord of the country sent Edigi, a man and a woman from among these savages that had been taken in the mountain. Or rather, sent to Edigi, rather. This was the location that they were sent to. Now, accounts like this, something I want to point out, I've been rather selective with, I've got a lot more than the ones that we're covering tonight. This is by no means the only ones that I have, but the ones that we're reviewing here are generally accounts where they describe full hair coverage, and also which are occurring in regions where the observations generally occur in a specific locale, not where a person has traveled to another country and they may be potentially observing people from another culture who may be from a different ethnic group that they wouldn't normally recognize, and thereby they may misinterpret them and even dehumanize them to an extent, and hence the traveler's tales that we hear about so often. In the cases I've tried to provide up to this point, we're talking about people who go to a region, and in that region, they recognize that there's another kind of people who live on the fringes in very remote areas. These people described as living fairly, subsisting off of the land, mostly off of plant matter like other animals, but also featuring essentially full hair coverage. And in the account that Schiltberger gives us, again, he says, they're covered all over the body with hair except the hands and the face, and run around like other wild beasts in the mountain, and also eat leaves and grass and anything they can find. So it doesn't sound very much like he's describing just some people. Yeah. And I would say the same of some of the accounts from China that we looked at earlier, where rather than people traveling to another country and encountering people they aren't familiar with, they go into the mountains in their own country and they say there are things like people that exist there. And I definitely find these to be rather interesting accounts in that regard, because, you know, it does seem to kind of parallel the idea of here in North America, the last place you'd ever expect to find something man-like, you know, existing in the remote wilds. And yet this is the exact sort of narrative that is presented. People say that they go into the mountains, oh my God, and I saw a Sasquatch, right? It's very similar. And in fact, again, that commonality exists in a lot of these historical accounts as well. And, you know, at this point, really, I would like to maybe bring it back over into North America, tell you the truth, because, I mean, really, this is where people know Sasquatch best. Again, let's start with the whole idea of the hoax being born in 1958. There was, and again, to try and temper my own tendencies at times toward belief, you know, I buy books by skeptics too. And, you know, for instance, Joshua Blue Bew's book, Bigfoot, the Life and Times of Legend, fantastic read. I also bought Loxton and Prothero's book, Abominable Science, a while back. Mm-hmm. And are you guys familiar with that book by chance?
The name is, I've heard the name, yeah, but have not read it.
No, I don't think I know that way. I mean, unless if we might have referred to it in our Yeti series, but I'm not sure if we have.
Yeah.
I don't, it doesn't sound familiar to me.
It's, you know, it's a good book. It's a very worthwhile book, but Daniel Loxton, I believe, was the one who authored the chapter on Bigfoot. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I found that chapter, despite the book overall being very interesting and a very good skeptical perspective on the topic. I mean, Loxton's chapter on Bigfoot, I was not impressed with it. It seemed like it was very, I think it's safe to say, shallow research, in the sense that he didn't dig deeply enough. A few of the points that he raises in the book, for instance, in that chapter, he says that John Green unequivocally describes Sasquatch as written about by J.W. Burns, first in 1929 in Maclean's magazine, introducing British Columbia's hairy giants, is his famous article, where he takes this sort of anglicized version of a Halcomelum word and presents this, you know, anglicized derivative Sasquatch that we now know. In that book, Loxton essentially says, well, John Green says these things are, you know, the Sasquatch were unequivocally giant Indians. They weren't described as being hairy or ape-like. They were just giant Indians. Another thing he says is that William Rowe is the first account from around 1955. This, again, Forrest, the one that you referred to earlier. This is the first account where we see a description that sounds anything like the giant hairy ape that we recognize today. Hadn't even been present at the time in 1958 of the footprints hoaxed by Ray Wallace at Bluff Creek, because, again, keep in mind, that made headlines. William Rowe comes forward with his story thereafter, and I believe it was first published in the Vancouver province, his account of meeting a female Sasquatch there on Micah Mountain.
Yeah,
that's where it actually occurred, Micah Mountain. Another assertion is that, of course, the Patterson Gimlin film also depicts a female Sasquatch, and therefore, in Loxton's view, the William Rowe encounter is extremely important, because this is not only the first account we have of a, you know, ape-like creature that really creates Bigfoot, but this is also, no doubt, the inspiration for the Patterson Gimlin hoax. Okay, so these are some of the points in that chapter, and I'm thinking, my gosh. So let's go down the list here. As far as the giant Indian extrapolation, this, of course, and this had been something that John Green had written about. Again, if we reference On the Track of Sasquatch, John Green did write that in his early readings of J.W. Burns, he interpreted that Burns was kind of talking about giant Indians, and that these were much more like just giant humans rather than like ape-like creatures. The problem with that is that I have to differ with John Green on that point, and I'll reference a account that's provided by, let me see if I've got it here in my notes. I think I've got it here. if I go far enough, well, maybe I don't have it actually, but I can paraphrase. I can give you guys an idea of it here. Oh no, I do have it. Oh, look here. Yeah, I thought I had it in my notes. So if we go back to J.W. Burns' initial article, right, from Maclean's Magazine, 1929, we have an account that was published in that first article. And it was provided by a man named William Point, a resident of Agassiz, who, along with his girlfriend, was walking down a railroad track. And he wrote to J.W. Burns, and this is verbatim the account that appears in that first article. We were walking on the railroad track and within a short distance of the orchard when the girl noticed something walking along the track coming toward us. I looked up but paid no attention to it, as I thought it was some person on his way to Agassiz. But as he came closer, we noticed that his appearance was very odd, and on coming still closer, we stood still and were astonished, seeing that the creature was naked and covered with hair like an animal. We were almost paralyzed from fear. I picked up 2 stones with which I intended to hit him if he attempted to molest us, but within 50 feet or so, he stood up and looked at us. He was twice as big as the average man, with hands so long they almost touched the ground. It seemed to me his eyes were very large, and the lower part of his nose was wide and spread over the greater part of his face, which gave the creature such a frightful appearance that I ran away as fast as I could. So, covered in hair all over the body,
Right.
long arms that almost fall to the ground, a wide nose that covers half the face. I mean, this description is very consistent with modern descriptions of Sasquatch as we know it, or Bigfoot as it was known in 1958. And so, again, if we read no deeper than John Green, and John, in fairness, maybe early on misinterpreting the early accounts from J.W. Burns as just being giant Indians, that's not what's described necessarily at all. Although some of J.W. Burns' writings do describe the creatures supposedly building fires, having language, and other things. So again, if anything, there's a whole lot of inconsistency in the reports that J.W. Burns collected, but among some of them were descriptions that were explicitly like our modern concept of Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Moving on to the next point, the idea that William Rowe had been the first to describe an ape-like humanoid. Well, here again, if you read into chapter 2 of John Green's book, he describes the Ruby Creek incident, which occurred in the 1940s, predating William Rowe by more than a decade, which describes the Chapman family and how Mrs. Chapman said that she saw one of these giant creatures walking across a field, and it came and it raided a salt barrel full of fish in their property.
Right.
This is one of many instances that is cited, which also appeared notably in the Vancouver province, I believe, which had been one of the regional newspapers there, that describes these Bigfoot or Sasquatch as they had been known between 1929 and 1958 as being large, hair-covered, and humanoid. Now, again, in Abominable Science, they go further and even argue that, well, you know, in this case also, we don't even know if William Rowe existed. I mean, John Green seems to be one of the only people that ever corresponded with him. As far as I know, there's never a photograph that's ever emerged of the guy. And I couldn't find, John Kirk actually, who had complimented you guys, by the way, had been the very one who had told Loxton. I think the article about William Rowe first appeared in the Vancouver province. Loxton said I couldn't find it, so I don't know if it ever actually appeared there. We really have no evidence that, you know, or know anything otherwise about William Rowe and who he was. Well, I have a newspapers.com account.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not only did I find the original article, and there's a photograph of William Rowe in the article, but I found another photograph, maybe 3 actually, of William Rowe. So there are photographs of the guy.
And I believe his family members, haven't they? Some of them have spoken out, I believe.
His daughter actually appeared in a documentary in the 1970s on Sasquatch, and she is the one who produced the drawing based on what William Rowe he observed. Yes.
Yeah.
So again, with all fairness, because I think that there's some merit to the book, I was very unimpressed with the lack of depth to the research. But again, it goes even further than that, because again, then they go on to say that this had been the inspiration for Patterson and Gimlin. I'll abstain from talking about the Patterson-Gimlin film here, and I'll merely reference a fine several series long podcast series that was a couple of friends of mine did on this. It's probably the deepest and most authoritative look in audio format on this topic. And yes, I'm talking about Astonishing Legends. Please go back and listen to the series you guys did, everybody at home listening, on the Patterson-Gimlin film. You'll get the full story there, and there's indeed quite a lot to discuss. So I'm not going to talk about that tonight.
That's quite all right.
Thank you. That's a wonderful endorsement.
And, you know, and the last thing, guys, I'll talk about too. We were going to talk about Ape Canyon a bit. Really, the most significant takeaway about Ape Canyon, in my opinion, is the fact that around the time that was published, and again, Associated Press newspaper reports began to tell about the miners, the prospectors who had first, come out of the mountains around Mount St. Helens, so that they were attacked by mountain devils. Again, Loxton's contention had been there were no descriptions before 1955 of ape-like creatures. You can go back. You don't even have to have a newspapers.com account. If you go on the Library of Congress website, okay, Chronicling America, go search for Ape Man and narrow your search to around 1924. You'll find all kinds of newspaper reports from that era. Tribe of ape men around Mount St. Helens attack miners, unequivocally described as ape-like mountain devils covered in hair like a bear. And in a lot of these articles, there's a gentleman by the name of Jorg, or sometimes his name is spelled differently, but Totsky was his last name. And he had been a publisher of a magazine that was called I think it was called The Real American. This, of course, a Native American publication. The researcher Mark Mersell has done incredible research into this, and you guys should talk to Mersell sometime. He's one of my favorite guys and favorite researchers into all of this. But Totsky, of course, is saying, well, and he, of course, having associations with the Klallam tribe, Totsky said in the newspapers at that time, and appeared interviewed in many of them, saying, among the Klallam, these mountain devils described by Fred Beck and his mining companions, these are known to the Klallam. They are known as the Siatko, or the Siatik is, I think, the word that he used. And he said that, the Klallam thought that the Siatik had been extinct. We hadn't heard about them in 15 years. But he goes on to give a description of the Siatik. What's really interesting about all of this is, okay, we have, of course, the claim that Bigfoot begins in 1958, right? And that prior to 1950, well, really after 58, because that's when William Rowe comes forward with his story, but he claims it happened in 1955. Right. Really, we have no descriptions of an ape-like creature like Sasquatch as we know it today prior to that. That was the claim by the skeptics. Not only do we have a story like this, okay, numerous stories like this prior to 1958 and even 1955, reference the Chapman story. We can go back to 1929 when J.W. Burns first wrote about Sasquatch, and we see remarkable consistency in the description given by William Point. We go further back to 1924, and Fred Beck and his companions describe ape men that attacked them. We have Totsky describing the Siatik. And then if we go all the way back to the 1850s, this is the most fascinating aspect of all of this to me. One of the earliest ethnological accounts related to the Siatik or Siatko that appeared in writing was written by George Gibbs, a naturalist and ethnologist who had initially gone out to California during the gold rush, but ended up staying and doing incredible work as a anthropologist and ethnologist. But Gibbs had written, of course, a book called Tribes of Western Washington and Northwestern Oregon in 1877. There's no mention of Sasquatch in this book. And in fact, I want to quote another anthropologist, Wayne Suttles, who in 1972 wrote a great paper on the anthropological track of Sasquatch, I think was the title of this paper. And Suttles wrote, George Gibbs collected information on the Puget Sound area in the 1850s that was published in his Tribes of Western Washington and Northwestern Oregon in 1877. In the body of this work, there is no mention of Sasquatch-like beings, and there is in the appended dictionary of the Nisqually, in the Nisqually English section, the entry on the Siatko, a race of spirits who haunt fishing places. Now, that's basically all that's said in that published version of the book. But wait, there's more. A little known fact is that there was an unpublished portion from the book that never made it to print, that didn't surface from George Gibbs' original writings until many decades later. In fact, this didn't come to light until after 1972, or actually it may have been published prior to then, but it's likely that Wayne Suttles, probably by 1972, hadn't seen that when he notes that Gibbs doesn't say anything about the Siatko in this book that he wrote. That didn't mean that he never wrote about it, though, because I found in the, I believe this was published in the, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, volume 56, number 4, December 1955, in an article by none other than Ella E. Clark, the fact that there had been this redacted portion that didn't go to print in the book, which a great-grandniece of George Gibbs had kept all these years, and then she turns it over to the Oregon Historical Society, and it's published. And you won't believe what's actually said in this portion that didn't appear in the original print, but which only surfaces decades later. I will now quote from the original manuscript of George Gibbs. Once thought lost to time. He says, one other race of beings I have classed separately, as they in particular are supposed to infest the earth and do not appear to have been properly elliptilicum. This a reference to spirit creatures in various traditions among the Northwestern indigenous Americans. They are Siatko, he says, in the Upper Chehalis, Statatl, or in the Klickitat, the Shiaha. They believe in these beings, or rather their belief in these beings is apparently universal among the different tribes, though there is a great discrepancy in the accounts of them. By some, the Siatko are described as of gigantic size, their feet 18 inches long and shaped like a bear's. They wear no clothes, but the body is covered with hair like that of a dog, only not so thick. Others describe them as being of natural size and resembling men, except that they gibber and chatter, one Siatko making noise enough to represent a dozen persons. They are said to live in the mountains and holes underground and to smell badly. They come down chiefly in the fishing season, at which time the Indians are excessively afraid of them. At the report of Siatko, they all run for their houses, fire their guns, and shout. They are visible only at night, at which time they approach the houses, steal salmon, carry off young girls, and smother children. Their voices are like that of the owl, and they possess the power of charming, so that those hearing them become demented or fall down in a swoon. A Klickitat informed me that he believed that they were not elliptilicum or of the demon race, but came afterwards, and that part of them are still men and dwell beyond the mountains, where they hunt and are very hospitable, while the others steal at night. They are sometimes seen spearing fish themselves. Now, that's the account from George Gibbs that didn't originally appear in the publication of his book, but which the original manuscript retrieved later conveys. But guys, finally, here we also have, going all the way back to the middle of the 19th century, a very elaborate description of the same thing that Totsky is describing in 1924, which he's saying this is what the miners at Ape Canyon saw, the Siatko. So as far as the American history of these creatures going beyond 1955, I actually would argue there's quite a lot of information about these things. And here again, as we see with George Gibbs' account, remarkable consistency, hair coverage all over the body, size, the length of the footprint, the odor, a lot of tremendous similarity to our modern concept of Sasquatch.
There, I mean, I don't think you could have drawn a clearer line. Correct me, did you mention how it was Burns, right, who or not appropriated, but applied the term Sasquatch to through his experiences? J.W.
Burns, this was, best we know, he invented the term Sasquatch based on a Halkomelem term, which I'll probably butcher this, but it probably would have been pronounced more like Saskate or Sasquate.
Yeah,
There are different variants among the different tribes, and in fact, actually, Wayne Suttles in his research paper from 1972 goes down the list of all the different variants of names, and the one that he thinks had actually been the progenitor that J.W. Burns probably borrowed from. Let me see if I've got really quickly here.
Okay. Because while you're looking for that, I just want to say, in listening to some of the programming you provided to us that you've done in other shows, I really liked the through line that you demonstrated in terms of how the names changed and the words changed, and but along the way, and you've made that point very well here tonight, especially with the timeline. There's a consistency to these ideas of these men going back, or these creatures, I should say, going back to these very, very early times, and you can find that thread there. And it does seem like it's a mistake to disconnect each time a different culture is describing it a different way, just to cut that string. By the same token, though, it's a long time ago. There's no research. Connecting it is hard too, but I guess, there's a preponderance of circumstantial evidence that's very, very intriguing. And I think you've done an excellent job of tying that together.
Well, and I'll just add one final point again. I have to sympathize to an extent with skeptics who say, look, really, there's not enough physical evidence to form the basis of a realistic expectation that these creatures exist. And therefore, I think they justify not looking very deeply into the historical record. But what I'm hoping to try and establish, like you're talking about there, Scott, is Bigfoot didn't begin with a hoax in 1958. there's some confusion about the difference based on, again, I think a misreading of John Green's interpretation of J.W. Burns' writing, which has led to the idea that Sasquatch is somehow a different cultural concept entirely from the idea of Bigfoot.
Right.
I don't think that's the case. And again, if you do look deeply enough, you see consistency in the narratives, consistency in the descriptions, and continuity. I think that we can at least take all the way back to the middle of the 19th century with George Gibbs' account, drawn from ethnological lore, of course, that he was collecting. And I haven't established, I don't know if we'll ever know why that portion wasn't included in his final book, but I'm so glad that he had this relative, this grandniece, who supplies this to a historical society decades later and says, here's my great granddad's or great uncle's book, and you guys might enjoy seeing this. Oh, look, here's a whole portion that was never published. This little historical, snippet may not be of great significance to others, but I mean, as time would show, this could be of incredible significance in the historical establishment of Sasquatch and whatever name it's known by in any given period, its apparent historical presence that goes back indeed much further than 1955 or 1958.
Right.
Well,
and I just quickly, Forrest, and you can hop in here, but just to reiterate, one of your main points is that a lot of folks who are skeptical about the existence of this being, and including yourself, which is good. I'm not lumping you in on this reasoning, but that you were like, I haven't seen the hard proof yet. But by the same token, a lot of other folks who are maybe taking an easier way out say, oh, it goes back to this hoax with Ray Wallace, 1958. But you can already just very easily show incidents in the decades leading up to that and then go even further. And I think that that's the important overall point that people need to understand about the information you've presented tonight.
That and one final point also. Again, the idea that if humans arrived in North America, presumably from traversing a land bridge that existed at some time toward the end of the Pleistocene, the general idea had traditionally been that it would have had to have been toward the end of the Pleistocene when we have the recession of the glaciers that opened temporarily this sort of sweet spot where the glaciers have receded enough, but sea levels haven't risen high enough that there's a land bridge that actually bridges parts of Eurasia and North America, and that again the earliest what were yet to become indigenous Americans arrive on the continent at this point. But there's, again, growing archaeological evidence that supports the idea that watercraft were probably used. In fact, this may go all the way back to Homo erectus. Homo erectus probably was using watercraft. And although people have often argued and said, well, there's no evidence of that, of course there's no evidence because it's perishable technology. It's not like stones where you have arrowheads and spear points and things. We're talking about wood. We're talking about, cordage, and other kinds of technologies that would have been great at floating, not very good at, lasting thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Now, my point in raising this point here is that it very well may have been that people didn't have to wait until there was a land bridge. They could have actually been bouncing along the coastlines. And again, when we go further
coastal migration theory, yeah.
Right. And, I've interviewed Dr. Tom Dillahay. I mean, talk about one of the most influential modern anthropologists. He excavated Monte Verde down in Chile. And of course, this unequivocally established the earlier than Clovis or pre-Clovis idea as far as American archaeology, North and South American. But there are also radiocarbon dates from the adjacent Monte Verde site, which go even further back to maybe in excess of, 34,000 years. That strongly suggests that there was someone there a long, long, long time ago. And there are also North American archaeological sites that, while many of them are disputed, they suggest not only that humans were here a long time ago, but also that they might have been here on the continent. And this is where we get really speculative, but some of the evidence is suggestive of a human presence even prior to when Homo sapiens sapiens were believed to have exited Africa, which raises another intriguing possibility. Could there have been another kind of hominin in North America that was actually responsible for some of this archaeological evidence? Might that be one interpretation? It's possible. Yeah. But again, if we know humans made their way from Eurasia over into North America, it's not impossible that other species did this as well. And that's the whole contention. That's the whole reason of looking at historical references to these things. If they're in North America, they wouldn't be specific to North America. They'd have to be elsewhere. And at least what we've looked at tonight with the historical record is suggestive. That's one interpretation, that indeed we find those historical accounts in the old world too.
Right. Well, just a couple of points as we get near the end here of our discussion, and we could go on for many more hours, and will perhaps socially over some good beverages and a campfire and some guitar playing.
Yeah.
Just because this is all fascinating to us, and I can see by the comments that we've luckily latched on to a topic that the people were always interested in, and I think hoping that we'd get to, or anyone would, or they didn't realize how interested they would be in it, because there is so much this breadth and overview of the historical record of this, and so I want to make a couple of points. First of all, it's like I take some stock into people's eyewitness accounts, and I like to relay this one story that this did appear. Well, first of all, I guess there was there is a perception by people who are kind of wonks in this area, and they really study it, and it's an idea of we mostly encounter this, or I thought about it with you could say spirit research and ghosts, and the overall view is like there's zero evidence anything spiritual, anything ghost wise, this and that. And my counter to that is that yes, there is. It just depends on what you think is evidence, what you consider is, I guess, good enough. And we just encountered that where in our coverage of the house that inspired The Conjuring. So it was the Arnold estate in New Hampshire, and the idea that there was a family that experienced 10 years of outrageous spiritual activity, if you believe them, and then the people that moved in afterwards experienced a few strange things that shouldn't have happened, or that were unexplainable, but not much. And then you have the view that it just when I was there, or when I talked to the people that actually lived there, it just wasn't enough evidence for me. It's weird, but I'm not impressed. And so then you also wonder about pieces that we haven't found yet. And again, going back to your guest here on your inaugural episode, David George Gordon, and one of the phrases that I love the most is an absence of evidence is not evidence of an absence.
Right.
Is that it just because you haven't found it yet? Well, and here, just as we've been talking about all night, it was a piece of a jawbone, and I believe a fragment of a hand bone. There was a little bit more than the jawbone that went with the sample, but like maybe 3 or 4 pieces at the most, tiny pieces. And it's accepted now that Gigantopithecus blacki existed, was a real thing, and it was this huge. Whereas people don't want to believe that an ape could be 9 feet tall. That's monstrous. And that it could have lived. It could be extant. But just from that little piece, I think mainstream scientists, anthropologists, zoologists have generally accepted its existence from a piece of evidence that they consider worthwhile. That we've checked it. It's you can extrapolate that, its size, and we're going to accept that. So that's accepted. But then you get to, and I agree, some other things they don't exist. So it's like with any bit of history beyond the pieces that we have, and we came across this with, I always thought it was fascinating with our Göbekli Tepe research, and that archaeologists were saying, like, well, this was constructed before the invention of the wheel. And so that kind of blows our mind, because the common pop perception is that there's a little cartoon caveman carving a wheel out of a piece of stone and putting an axle in it and using that as a wheel. It's like we don't have evidence of that. But if it was made out of wood, that may very well have rotted away, and there's no evidence of it. But I believe there are other signs and indications that they were not using wheel technology when they built this thing. And you're talking about slabs of stone that were carved, some weighing up to 17 tons. And transported over great distances. Same thing with Stonehenge. We just don't know. So I want to get to this is interesting, because there are, I guess what I'm getting at is there is a gripe here in the comments about how what they consider facts that you're not getting to. So, and this is what I find interesting is that, well, up to a certain point, there is just a written record, as with anything in history. And if you didn't believe that, then there was no ancient world. We have ruins, but beyond the pottery that was discovered, I believe at Jericho, was it Pottery A and Pottery B, or I'm getting that wrong, but basically two different periods based on the pottery designs. We had no knowledge of their life before that. And other than that there are stones arranged in possibly a housing configuration, these people may not have existed because we just don't have enough evidence, or what we consider good evidence. But we know they're there, and we certainly don't know what they lived like because nobody wrote it down then. Or you're talking about a society that didn't have written language, but those oral traditions are passed down, and maybe some remnants of it are wrong and some are misinterpreted, but there's got to be some kernels of truth in there. But so I guess the question to you is, first of all, I'm not sure what this person is talking about, but it's just like, what would you say to the question that there are facts that you're not getting to? Or maybe that because everybody in here is just saying they love your approach. You're trying to take the academic through line of what is known and staying with that and not veering off into the unknowns, as entertaining as they may be. But what do you think is generally considered facts that we can go by, I guess?
Well, first, let me just say that, since this isn't a parapsychological discussion, I won't claim to be a mind reader. But if we're talking about, and I'm not seeing the chat, so I'm going off of your paraphrasing there. If there are facts I'm not getting to, perhaps what's being referenced is, what about the evidence for the existence of these creatures today, right? And again, if I'm not touching on those elements and I'm only seeming to deal with like 1958 and before, that's entirely intentional. And again, I don't know if this is the answer in response to the question that was being asked. But again, let me just state for the record what I'm trying to look at here. In response to the idea that there's no evidence in the historical record and written accounts throughout history that seem to describe an awareness by people throughout time of something equivalent to our modern concept of relict hominoids like Bigfoot or Sasquatch, what I'm attempting to provide are an analysis of what might be at least good contenders, reasonable contenders, that do support the idea that there's a historical record that does actually recount observations of these creatures in some instances, with, of course, full knowledge of the care one must take in knowing that looking back, travelers' tales, the unfortunate dehumanization of different cultural groups, racism, a number of factors that are present and that are, of course, endemic to human interactions and throughout cultures throughout time, with recognition for all of those, elements. If we're careful and we look at some of these historical accounts, I do think that some of them do describe what certainly would be a good match for our modern concept of the relict hominoid. That's what I'm trying to do. And again, if there are facts that aren't being addressed, it may be indeed some of the physical evidence that, modern proponents would discuss. But again, I would say, please go listen to, or, read, more importantly, since so few people read these days, go read the works of Jeffrey Meldrum, Sasquatch Legend of Science. Go read Dr. John Bendernagel's books, the discovery of the Sasquatch. Go read John Green's work. Go read, Peter Burns' book. There's an updated version of his book, The Search for Bigfoot, which he republished and which is available at his website. Which I highly recommend because of the historical value of his perspectives, but also the field research that he was doing. The one book that Renee Day Hendon wrote, co-authored, I believe, with Don Hunter, is well worth the read. Grover Krantz, of course, also wrote about this. He published papers, but he also wrote a couple of books, like Bigfoot Sasquatch Evidence is the title that it's available under nowadays. Here's a scientist really seriously looking at this from an anthropological perspective. And there are countless other books that we could name as well. One of them I mentioned also earlier was Chad R. Mint's book, The Historical Bigfoot. Right. All these are going to provide additional details. And again, there are plenty of facts, but within the purview of this conversation, let me be clear, I'm trying to help establish a possible historical lineage that might help us frame the idea that these creatures didn't just somehow spring into existence through a portal in 1958.
Yeah, exactly. And it's worldwide here. And it's just kind of the last thing that A couple of anecdotes I love telling, so I'm going to do it here because
Sure.
podcasting, it can also be an indulgent media form. So as we've proven time and time again, is that yes, there's a cultural aspect which Scott and I fervently respect and admire, and you take it for what you will, but we love to present it. You're going to believe it whether no matter what we say, and you should believe what you're inclined to, and consider fact or fiction, fakery, up to your own sense of reason, and it has to make sense to yourself. So what I would say here is going back to one thing I wanted to mention is that we came across in the strangest places when we do this kind of research is the Russian Yeti and the Mansi peoples, the indigenous peoples of Siberia and Russia, and especially Sverdlovsk Oblast in that area and the area of Dead Mountain. It's like, oh yeah, that's the Mank, and we fear them, we respect them, but we don't mess with them. And that is so much the cultural vibe around the world is that the people that live in the area, the people that have been living there for generations, hundreds of years, thousands of years. In the case of the Nepalese in the Himalayas or the Himalayas, however you want to pronounce it, and the work of Dr. Daniel Green, and looking at what is making these tracks actually, and I think from my last reading, the Nepalese people, that area was first inhabited by human beings maybe over 500 years ago. Not ancient, but respectably long enough ago that lots of generations have seen all the flora and fauna that are in the area and know it well, and no disrespecting of anyone else that comes in that's not native to the area, but you're trying to tell them what they know about their own area, where you have not lived there for generations and they've passed down the traditions. And the fact that is that they've figured out how to survive there and be a part of the environment and the nature around them and survive in harmony with, and that time get to know what's there. So two things I want to say though about, I guess it's two of my favorite stories that we talked about this before we started rolling, and I think you weren't that familiar, but we'd spoken about this in our Yeti episodes. And there is a documentary. Actually, there's two that came out that are of a host that feature the host Mark Evans, and he has some background in basically an adventure, some background in biology and zoology. I think I can't remember his bona fides, but he's not just a TV pretty face going on these expeditions, but he's determined to go to the places where Yeti evidence, as in hide, fur, finger bones, things that are relics, in the Himalayas, and test it for DNA. So there was two documentaries, and there are two things I like about it. One, the first one is the aspect of he goes to Nepalese people that are living there, the Sherpas, and he talks to them, and he asks about their legends and traditions and their oral stories. And the one that I came away loving is that one of the elders, and it was the uncle of the kind of the younger man. He's probably in his mid-30s, and it was an older uncle, maybe even a great uncle. And I believe this happened in the 1960s or early 70s. He had never traveled to the United States, but he was taken to the Bronx Zoo. Again, I think this is the late 60s or early 70s. And there's some discussion, of course, about the animals that are native to his area. And as they got to the bear cages, somebody who was one of his chaperones or tour guides was saying, like, well, there you go. Now that's that bear there, that is similar to what you think your Yeti is, right? And the elder, that he's probably at that time he's probably in his late 60s or 70s, like, no, that's a bear. I know the difference between a bear and a Yeti, and you're mistaken. That's not a Yeti. And they're like, oh, okay. And as you do respectfully, he's like, okay, well, we'll see about that. And then they get to the gorilla cages, and he goes, now that's a Yeti. I've seen that. That is more like a Yeti than the bear, which you're trying to tell me is a Yeti. And my thing is, don't tell the guy what he knows. He's grown up for generations. His people have for 500 years. They know the animals. They know what they've seen. They've heard the cries. They've seen evidence. And I do believe one is not mutually exclusive of the other. You can have something like a Himalayan or Nepalese brown bear with a weird paw print and a weird way of climbing trees, leaving tracks that are befuddling to outsiders that come and they're like, look at that thing. Like, that's a huge, giant, big old toe on that thing. That's not a bear, but it actually is. And so that's Dr. Daniel Taylor's mission with his books and research was to find out what that is with DNA. But that does not rule out something that is more hominin, something that is more bipedal. Even though this bear can walk on 2 feet, and it's been seen doing that, there's something that can be more manlike, let's say, human-like. So that's one aspect that I like, is that basically they're trying to tell this guy what he knows, who's an elder, and it's still not respected. It's just like, it's just old tales, you know. The second thing I like is that the follow-up documentary, and I believe that was called Yeti: Myth, Man, or Beast, which is kind of a follow-up to the first one. So again, that is Mark Evans, and he talks to some people who are kind of in the know, and they're trying to get at DNA. That's the end goal here. So, as I said, Denisovan DNA was only discovered 6 years ago, so it's not like it's been around for a long time. They meet up with Reinhold Messner. He's got a sample, and usually these things turn out to be bears or something else. Weirdly, he claims to have had Himmler's. Heinrich Himmler's Nazi bear that he sent them into the area, into the region to look for this Aryan super hominin. They came back with something which the lead there, Schaefer, had stuffed. Ernst Schaefer, the leader of the expedition for Himmler, had stuffed. So that's the approach of the second documentary, and they are then sending samples back to evolutionary biologist Dr. Charlotte Lindqvist. And here's what I like. So I think what happens in connection with her, and she's testing all this for DNA, with the team that goes to explore this high mountain region where there's a pond of water, and the locals will say, well, we've never seen anything, we've seen Yeti in the area. But we've never seen anything like a monkey or a gorilla. Certainly that they don't live this high up. They can't. They don't seem to exist here. There's nothing for them to eat. It's pretty barren. So what they did was with a biologist, and I can't remember her name, but she was French in origin. They take a sample of water, they strain it for DNA, because anything that would drink out of that pool, walk through it, bathe in it, sit down in it, is going to leave traces of DNA behind. They sift the water. They're very careful about taking samples. They send those back, and the twist is that they find something that is 99% human. Now, what that tells you is that it's not a person. It's not a human that may have drank out of that or washed their hands in it or stepped through it. The only other surprising thing was that they found DNA from I believe a sheep or a goat that was not suspected of being in the area. So they know that things that typically aren't there or known to have been there have been up that high and did drink out of that pond. But the finding that there's something that's 99% human in DNA, but not a gorilla or ape or monkey that was in that pond is pretty startling. And I think that's a great starting point to finding out. There you go. There's your science. There's your proof, your facts, your evidence.
Yeah, and I think that's a more, again, not to say that there isn't good science that is done by skeptics. There certainly is. But I think that what I favor is a more proactive kind of a scientific effort, which unfortunately in this kind of research can be fruitless at times, because people may go out there searching for something, maybe not necessarily expecting to find it, but hoping that they'll find something, and then they never, produce any physical evidence, and they have to eventually say, well, after traveling into the heart of the Congo and looking for Mokele Mbembe and not finding actual dinosaurs, I guess I have to presume that maybe this is a less likely, a possibility than I had once thought it was. I mean, again, that's just one example. In this instance, I think that with Sasquatch, I really favor the proactive scientific effort to say, okay, with the abundance of anecdotal evidence, can we get out there and can we find hard evidence, which again, I think is complemented by historical data, which may provide a few other clues as well. For instance, this is something that R. Mintz talks about in his historical Bigfoot. If we look at the broader distribution of sightings reports over time and throughout history, this may also help lead to further research in the future in terms of being able to locate geographical locations that are going to be concentrations and where, future research may be more fruitful and other things. So again, I really think that, a sort of a whole of we hear, for instance, recently the government saying a whole of government approach to studying UFOs, right? We need to get, all these intelligence agencies, the military in on this and everything. I would say that we really need a similar kind of a holistic approach to study of Sasquatch, not just say, let's send the weekend warriors out there and have them collect the evidence. Let's try and get scientists who are sympathetic to the idea of the discovery of new species to also, support some of these efforts, maybe to temper some of the eager enthusiasm of the weekend warriors, look at the historical data, but also look at the anthropological, considerations and other areas too. Look at psychology, look at sociology, and look at how belief and cultural factors influence people's ideas and preconceptions about these things. But really, again, a more holistic sort of, a completer kind of analysis like that may prove very beneficial. But at the end of the day, like you say, Forrest, getting out there, getting evidence in the form of DNA or something along those lines that gives us a shred of physical proof, that's really what's going to be able to do it in the end, I think.
Yeah.
That's really what's going to finally close the book on this.
Yeah.
Well, Micah, we just want to thank you so much for joining us tonight and giving us so much of your time and your research. It's been very, very much appreciated by our listeners. And for folks who joined us as we attempted to test out our streaming, thank you very much for joining us. You can find Micah Hanks at all his stuff at micahhanks.com. Why don't you tell the listeners about your various projects? You work with 4 podcasts that you have going on now?
Yeah, right now, there's, of course, the flagship, the Micah Hanks program, which is, my main podcast with all the UFO stuff going on right now. That's been the main focus as of late. But I occasionally intentionally diverge, and we even talk about Sasquatch from time to time on that show. But there's an entire podcast I do twice monthly about the Sasquatch subject, and it's called Sasquatch Tracks. Easy to remember. And that's available at sasquatchtracks.com. And then I'll also produce the 7 Ages Audio Journal, which is a archaeology podcast. I mean, it's not fringe stuff. It's not looking at, ideas, and speculations. I mean, it really deals in the area of serious archaeology. And my guys and I, Jason and James and I, have actually visited a number of archaeological sites and actually volunteered and done some field work. And you can tell that a lot of my experience in that field influences the anthropologically centric and historically minded approach that I take with the Sasquatch subject in this research. And then, of course, there are other podcasts I produce. Middle Theory is a news and current events podcast I also do. All that stuff you can find at micahhanks.com. And indeed, I'm involved in a number of different writing projects, some related to this subject and some related to other subjects, but I'm sure there'll be plenty of fodder for future conversations, my friend.
Yes, well, and don't forget the debrief, right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, the debrief.org, which of course is it's a news website that looks at science, technology, and all sorts of other things. Of course, there's a lot of UFO coverage there too. I co-founded this website with Tim McMillan and NJ Benias and Steve McDaniel and a bunch of other fine folks who are involved. Really have made that quite a project, and we've certainly done a lot of reporting in recent days with regard to the evolving narrative of the government's involvement with UAP. But I'd had that idea a long time ago, and these guys have really helped to kind of see that to fruition. I couldn't ask for better partners in an endeavor like the debrief, but that's the debrief.org is the website, and I think that's everything. I'm probably forgetting something else too. But so I mean,
you're too prolific, man.
Oh, well, here we go. Here's one thing. What about the Momo monster, the Momo beast? With the part I love. There's always an aspect of these encounters that, again, if I would say if you believe the people, if the accounts are accurate, because I believe a lot of them to be genuine or at least sincere. But like you said, in that state, you're panicked. So is everything accurate, especially upon reflection? But the long-haired, very long-haired creature, almost Shaggy in a cartoon way, covering the face.
Cousin It.
Cousin It, but with very long arms, giant hands and feet. Purported to be naked. I guess why would you wear clothing? Why would you need clothing if you had all that hair? But basically runs up on these two young women having a picnic in their Scott. What was it? A Volkswagen Bug, I think. And they just they just spread out a blanket. We're going to enjoy a picnic lunch. Runs up on them. Of course, I think comes up to the car, puts his hands on the front of the hood, which is probably his way of just saying hello. But of course, you don't want to see that. They take off, of course, and he eats their egg salad sandwiches. So that is in one gulp. There was notice who just. So again, it's not only the anthropological aspect of it, which fascinates me in the science and the things we know and the advancement of that, but it's also the lore that I love. It's the folklore aspect of it. It's the tall tales to some Albert Ostman to some degree, because it's also fascinating, which I think is why it's one of my favorite topics. I love them all, but really in this case, it's kind of getting back to Beowulf. It's the monstrous aspects of ourselves, the noble savage. It's the when we look at them, we see ourselves, and I think that can titillate us. It can excite us. It can also scare us, and it's not often easy to do.
Certainly, yeah. All points taken. And, again, maybe at some point we'll have to accept that there is no reality to Sasquatch. I mean, I personally doubt that. I strongly feel that there is an actual basis to this that's more than just myth. But again, even if we had to accept at some point that myth was all it was, it's no less fascinating,
Mm-hmm.
Indeed. Well, thanks again for joining us and staying with us so long tonight, Micah. We will see you again soon. And for you, the rest of you folks, this will make up the crux of our content for our next episode. So I hope you enjoy it.
And we're going to have you back on when the UFO lands on the White House lawn, because that's got to be next.
Yeah, I'm hoping for that too. And I'll be here with bells on.
All right. Deep from the bunker. All right.